Chapter 25:51. After the seven tribulation powerhouse bade farewell to Luo Fan, he turned around and returned to the city next to the mainland of the tall tower, continuing his life that had lasted for many years. However, for some reason, he felt that everything he did was not right, as if he had done something guilty, as if he owed someone something. His heart felt heavy. As a seventh tribulation powerhouse, he naturally had a deep understanding of his own mind. After a few days, he understood what was going on with him. Betrayal. He sighed inwardly, his face full of bitterness. He used to love his wife to the core. Occasionally, he would even think that if he had to sacrifice his life to help his wife, he would definitely not hesitate. However, a few days ago, the choice that Luo Fan gave him made him realize that he was not as resolute as he thought. His love for his wife wasn't as deep as he thought it was. It was this realization that made him feel like he was betraying his wife. It was this feeling that made his heart feel heavy, as if he had done something shameful. I'm a cultivator who pursues transcendence. It's not unreasonable for me to make such a decision. Although it's important to stay together, if I lose my life, there's nothing left. He finally sighed inwardly. His mood gradually became relaxed, and the heavy burden that was originally pressing on his heart was put down in the blink of an eye. For a cultivator of this level, his understanding and control of his own mind were extremely deep. Such an existence would naturally completely accept one's own mind after recognizing one's own mind. Since he'd realized that his love for his wife couldn't suppress his desire for life and cultivation, then he naturally accepted this feeling of his. As for mortals in the secular world, when they realized that they did not love the other party as much as they imagined, and when they realized that their decision was to betray the other party, they had to bite the bullet and carry out their previous thoughts, carry out their original vows, and force themselves to do things that they did not want to do. For an existence of this level, since he had already realized that his love for his wife was at this level, he just had to accept his own mind and feelings and adjust his attitude to adapt to his own mind and feelings. In this way, he would naturally appear in such a manner. He clearly knew that his actions could be said to be a betrayal of the promise he had made back then, a betrayal of his wife, but he did not force himself to gamble with his life. Following the change in his mind, he faintly felt that the bottleneck he had encountered before seemed to be slightly shaken, as if his cultivation was about to climb to a higher level. This kind of improvement was unexpected, and he couldn't help but reveal a faint smile. Of course, even so, he did not abandon his wife and return to the seventh level to cultivate in seclusion. He wanted to break through this bottleneck in one go. Although he knew that his love for his wife wasn't as deep as he thought, it didn't mean that he completely ignored his wife. Not reaching that depth was just not that deep. It did not mean that it did not exist at all. If he thought that his love hadn't reached that depth, he would abandon his wife because of it, and directly treat his wife as a passerby, a person that he wanted to kill. It would obviously be overcorrecting. If there was love, then treat it with the attitude of love. If the love wasn't that deep, then don't do the behavior of deep love. This was obviously the right way to treat. And for this, the cultivator from his seventh level of the road to Tao Master was naturally very clear. As his mind became clearer, there were signs of a breakthrough in his cultivation realm. He suddenly felt that his thinking had become clearer than ever. The entire process of the conversation with Luo Fan emerged in his mind again. Every detail, every word, and every tone of the other party, at this time, went through his mind again. So it's a test. At this time, he could not help but show a strange expression on his face, only feeling a little helpless. After going through all the things that had happened before, he clearly discovered the various intentions behind Luo Fan's words, and knew that those words were a test for him. At the same time, he came to an understanding. If he agreed to it earlier, then he would have definitely not suffered the same fate as he did and had to barely escape from that place of fortuitous encounters. After understanding this, it was easy to imagine how he felt in his heart. After all, he was an expert from the seventh level of the road to Tao Master. Even if Luo Fan had shown that his comprehensive strength was enough to be on an equal footing with them, In essence, he was just a fifth tribulation expert from the fifth level of the road to Down Master. No matter what, such an existence's status was not comparable to that of a seventh tribulation expert from the seventh level of the road to Down Master. In other words, compared to him, Luo Fan, in some aspects, could be regarded as an equal, but in essence he still thought that Luo Fan stood in a lower position than him. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan actually carried out a test for him. This was simply like an ant carrying out a test for an elephant, the absurdity of which could be imagined. Thinking back, how could he not laugh or cry? However, after all, it was because of Luo Fan's test that he was able to see his feelings clearly. At this time, this seventh tribulation expert was not very angry, nor did he have the intention to settle the score with Luo Fan. He just shook his head, sighed, and lifted his foot. In a flash, he had already arrived at the location of Luo Fan's cave residence. The moment the seventh tribulation expert arrived, Luo Fan instantly sensed his arrival and could not help but frown slightly. At this moment, he had already begun to analyze the various aspects of the place of opportunity that Taoist Hsien had given him. At this time, the seventh tribulation expert's arrival had once again interrupted his research. It would be strange if he could be happy. Not to mention, the seventh tribulation expert's appearance here was obviously not to give him any benefits. It must be related to the test from before, which naturally made him even more displeased. Immediately, he frowned and appeared outside the cave residence. He appeared in front of the seventh tribulation expert and said, "Fellow Taoist, could it be that you want to regain some face?" At this time, he had no intention of exchanging pleasantries. As for the seventh tribulation expert being able to see through his previous test, he did not find it strange at all. Perhaps because of the conflict in his heart at that time, the seventh tribulation expert did not react in time. However, a seventh tribulation expert was still a seventh tribulation expert. There was no need to say much about how strong his thinking ability was and how fast his reaction was. After going back and calming down, he would definitely be able to think clearly about everything that had happened and understand the meaning of his previous test. It was not surprising at all. Even so, he did not feel that he needed to be afraid of the seventh tribulation expert. No matter what, the seventh tribulation expert in front of him was just an incarnation of an aura. Such an existence was no match for him at the fifth level of the road to Down Master, in this forbidden area. Even if the other party wanted to turn against him, he did not think that he would fail. It was precisely because of this that he dared to directly test the seventh tribulation expert. The seventh tribulation expert just shook his head and said, "Of course not. I still have to thank you for the test you gave me. If it wasn't for that test, I would not have been able to confirm my feelings. I would not have been able to find the opportunity to break through like now." Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression slightly relaxed, and he said, "If that's the case, why didn't you find a place to break through? Why did you come here to find me?" Naturally, he did not think that the seventh tribulation expert in front of him was lying to him. After all, this kind of deception was meaningless. After all, the other party was a seventh tribulation expert. Such an existence, even if the incarnation of an aura was not as strong as him and did not have much ability to resist in front of him. But after all, the seventh tribulation was an existence that stood at a higher level than Luo Fan. Such an existence had its own pride in its heart. Lying was something that he disdained to do. At least, in the face of Luo Fan's words, it disdained to deceive, since the other party said that he did not take the test to heart and instead wanted to thank him. It was natural that he did not take it to heart and was naturally grateful. "I just want to trade with you for the method to safely leave that place of opportunity and choose the fifth level of the Down Master's path," the seventh tribulation expert said. Luo Fan lightly shook his head and said, "I don't have anything that I want from you." He was not surprised that the seventh tribulation expert knew that he was confident of obtaining the method to safely leave that place of opportunity. As long as the seventh tribulation expert could see that he was testing him, then it was only natural that he knew that he had a safe method. Hearing this, the seventh tribulation expert frowned slightly and said, "I have a lot of methods to enter the place of opportunity. If you are willing, I am willing to exchange 10 methods to enter the place of opportunity for this method. Luo Fan still shook his head and said, I do not lack methods to enter the place of opportunity. What I have now is enough for me to use. The Seven Tribulation expert was slightly stunned when he heard this. Then he thought about the number of cultivators who had appeared in this forbidden area to trade with Luo Fan and understood that Luo Fan was probably telling the truth. So many cultivators had come to trade with him. There was no need for all of them to use the method to enter the place of opportunity. Even if there was one, there would be more than 50 methods to enter the place of opportunity. With so many cultivators, how many could a cultivator explore? It could be said that the method to enter the place of opportunity was redundant for him. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that the other party did not care about the method to enter the place of opportunity. Luo Fan just looked at the Seven Tribulation expert and waited for his decision. The Seven Tribulation expert thought about it and sighed. I see. Then I will trade something else with you. As he spoke, he waved his hand, and an item appeared out of thin air in his hand. The object looked like a ruler made of bronze. There were strange markings on it, and each of the markings seemed to be constantly changing. It looked like some kind of living thing was forcibly compressed in this ruler. This is a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Luo Fan looked at it and understood. Pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were a kind of magic treasure that surpassed great overarching heavenly treasures, but they were inferior to real primordial origin spiritual treasures. The difference in levels of such magic treasures was extremely huge. The weaker ones might only be equivalent to the quasi-sage level. The stronger ones might even be equivalent to the 8 Tribulation or 9 Tribulation experts. With such a huge gap, the value of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures could be said to be a world of difference. At least for the current Luo Fan, most of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were already products that he could create with just a thought. They were a kind of thing that had no meaning at all. Only a 6 Tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was meaningful to him, but it was only temporary. When his cultivation realm rose to a level that surpassed a 6 Tribulation expert, this kind of 6 Tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure would be meaningless, and he would be able to create thousands of them at will. It was also because of this that Luo Fan no longer cared about pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures after he reached the level of a Tribulation expert. Instead of refining a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure that was compatible with his own level, he might as well use it on his own cultivation, on polishing his own cultivation. If he used it on this, perhaps the time spent on refining pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures would be enough for his cultivation realm to make a huge breakthrough. In fact, this was also the choice of most cultivators, ordinary cultivators, even those that Luo Fan met on the Tao Master's path, those who cultivated on the Tao Master's path, all had similar thoughts. They also didn't care about this kind of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. They also spent more time on their own cultivation realm. It was precisely because of this that on the Tao Master's path, the battles between cultivators were mostly about using their own divine abilities and the various powers that they had condensed. There weren't many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures involved. And what this 7 Tribulation expert took out was obviously a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Judging from the aura of this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, its level was definitely higher than Luo Fan's. In other words, it was at least a 7 Tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Chapter 2552. This 7 Tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure was obviously refined by a 7 Tribulation powerhouse in front of him. In it, Luo Fan could even sense a kind of aura that belonged to the 7 Tribulation powerhouse in front of him. If any 7 Tribulation powerhouse wanted to refine a 7 Tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, it would take a long time. It would take the powerhouse a long time from the beginning of the Tao cultivation to the 7 Tribulation powerhouse, to the end of the whole process. Even from the most optimistic point of view, If the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse wanted to cultivate to the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse, it would take billions of trillions of years. Under such circumstances, the time needed to refine such a Seven Tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure would be billions of trillions of years. Moreover, it might be several times longer than it was during this period of time. Only in this way could such a Seven Tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure be born. After all, for a magic treasure to become a Seventh Tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure was almost as difficult as raising an ignorant creature into a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. This level of difficulty was naturally even more difficult than one's own training. The amount of time needed was naturally even longer. It was because of this that Luo Fan said that the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse was quite free at this time. Hearing this, the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse just sighed and said, "The cultivation of the seventh level is completely different from the previous ones. There, time has no meaning at all. And if I don't see through a certain trick, I can't make any progress even if I spend countless years. Therefore, I naturally have enough free time to do these things that I am interested in." Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. At this moment, he knew that when he reached the seventh level of the Town Master's Road, the real battle was no longer about the cultivator's own cultivation or attack power, but the magic treasure. Although the magic treasure itself was difficult to refine, once successfully refined, it would have a great effect on the strength of the cultivator. After all, if the magic treasure itself was refined to the corresponding level, it would be equivalent to a cultivator of the corresponding level. If it was a Seventh Tribulation pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, then that was equal to a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. Like this, if a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse had a Seventh Tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, that was the same as doubling their strength. If they were to fight someone else, it would be the same as two powerhouses of the same level besieging each other. Apart from that, magic treasures had their own characteristics that cultivators didn't have. He was able to display abilities that many cultivators were unable to display. In this way, if used well, these treasures could become some kind of godly weapon that would greatly expand a cultivator's combat methods, allowing a cultivator's strength to increase a step further. With that in mind, Luo Fan immediately decided that no matter what this magic treasure was used for, he would agree to this deal. After all, the fact that this Seven Tribulation expert had taken out such a magic treasure was already the best reminder for him. It made him suddenly notice many things that he had overlooked before. Just this point alone was enough for Luo Fan to help him analyze and deduce a safe way to leave that place of opportunity. Not to mention, no matter how it was said, that magic tool was a Seventh Tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. It contained many of the mysteries of a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. If he could study it well, he might be able to gain a better understanding of the direction he should take in the future. At that moment, he said, "I see. I agree to this deal." When the Seven Tribulation expert heard this, his expression relaxed a little. If he wasn't even satisfied with this, then this Seven Tribulation expert would have to use his imagination. Fortunately, the other party agreed in the end. At that moment, he threw the ruler in his hand at Luo Fan. Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and the ruler fell into his hand. Although this ruler looked like it was made of bronze, that was obviously just its appearance. In essence, the material used for this ruler had already transcended the scope of what ordinary living beings thought of as matter. It could be said to be the condensation of concepts, the condensation of rules, and the condensation of the great Tao. Although it looked bronze, its weight was like a mountain or the sea. If Luo Fan hadn't expected it, he might have made a fool of himself at this time. After catching the ruler steadily, Luo Fan scanned it with his perception and instantly grasped the use of this ruler. In addition to the various abilities of ordinary magic treasures, the most special thing about this ruler was that it had a unique ability, and that was to measure all things. Even if it was the great Tao, this ruler could directly measure anything contained in it. Even if it was the method to enter the place of opportunity that Luo Fan had obtained, he could use this ruler to measure how many mysteries were contained in it. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan secretly praised in his heart. At the very least, this ruler was not useless in his following research work. It might even have a significant effect on the efficiency of his research in the future. At that moment, his perception rushed out. All the marks, power, and everything else that belonged to the seventh tribulation powerhouse on this ruler had been completely erased. They were replaced by Luo Fan's own marks, power, and power. In other words, in such a short period of time, the owner of this ruler had changed from the seventh tribulation powerhouse in front of him to Luo Fan. The seventh tribulation powerhouse couldn't help but be slightly shocked by such a straightforward method. Naturally, he was not shocked because Luo Fan had casually changed the owner of this ruler in front of him. Instead, it was because Luo Fan was shocked that the marks he had left in the ruler and everything else were so easily and completely removed. One had to know that no matter what, he was still a seventh tribulation cultivator. As a seventh tribulation powerhouse, he was at least 2 levels stronger than Luo Fan in front of him. Even the cultivation place he was in was far from what Luo Fan could spy on. Normally speaking, Luo Fan should not have the ability to resist his power, his imprint, and his might. It was absolutely impossible for him to waver in the slightest. However, right in front of him, right here, right in front of him, Yi Futian had easily and effortlessly wiped away all of his things, replacing them with his own things. How could he not be shocked? Could it be that he also came from the 7th level? Or could it be that he already had the strength to enter the 7th level, but he still stayed on the 5th level? At this moment, this thought flashed through his mind, which made him feel inexplicably absurd. Between these two possibilities, he was now inclined to the first one. He was inclined to think that Luo Fan had come back from the 7th level by some means that Tasso did not understand, and returned to the 5th level. After all, if the latter had the strength to enter the 7th level, but insisted on staying on the 5th level, it would be too strange and inexplicable. After all, the higher one went on the path of Tao Master, the better the cultivation environment would be. The cultivation environment on the 5th floor was obviously incomparable to the cultivation environment on the 6th floor. Compared to the cultivation environment on the 7th floor, the difference was like heaven and earth. In this way, once a normal cultivator had the opportunity to step into a higher level, he would definitely not let go of it. Based on this theory, he did not believe that someone who clearly had the strength to step into the next level would insist on staying on the next level. Even if it was a disciple of a perfectionist Tao Master, at most, they would stay on the next level when they were qualified to ascend to the next level, but they would not be so far away from the path of Tao Master by 2 levels. With all these thoughts in mind, the way he looked at Luo Fan changed again, and he became more concerned. Faintly, he became a little more vigilant. No matter what the possibility was, being able to do this meant that the cultivator in front of him was much stronger than he had imagined. As long as he knew this, his attitude towards Luo Fan obviously needed to change. I will give you the method in 3 years. Luo Fan put away the ruler and said to the 7th tribulation expert. Hearing this, the 7th tribulation expert was stunned and said, "So soon?" From the previous conversations, he could naturally guess that even if it was possible for Luo Fan to obtain a safe way to leave that place of opportunity, it would definitely take a period of effort to achieve it. In his opinion, this period of time would at least be counted in hundreds or even thousands of years. Unexpectedly, the time that Luo Fan finally gave him was only 3 years, which surprised him. Luo Fan only nodded indifferently and did not answer the doubts raised by the 7th tribulation expert. After all, no matter what he said now, as long as he did not take out the method in 3 years, everything he said now would be bullsh**. And no matter how quiet he appeared to be, as long as he could take out the method in 3 years, everything would be fine. Seeing this, the 7th tribulation expert tactfully said, "In that case, I will wait for the good news." As he spoke, he cupped his hands at Luo Fan and left. After the 7th tribulation expert left, Luo Fan turned around and returned to his cave abode. He began to carefully study the various memories of the place of opportunity that Taoist Xian had given him. Time slowly passed. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, a soft explosion suddenly rang out in Luo Fan's cave abode. The entire cave abode instantly collapsed. Shortly after, everything returned to normal in the next instant. Even the slightest detail was not missed. In just a short moment, the cave abode had already completed the entire process of exploding and reforming. It's finally done. I didn't expect it to actually take 3 years. Looks like I've still underestimated the mysteriousness of the place of opportunity. Luo Fan appeared in front of the cave abode with an indescribable expression on his face. Originally, he said that he would be able to pass the method to the 7th tribulation expert in 3 years. He had only made a rough estimate. He felt that no matter how long he delayed it, he should be able to deduce the safe method to escape within 3 years. Deep down, he had left a lot of leeway, thinking that he might be able to get the results in a few months. However, he did not expect that after studying the memories that Taoist Xian had given him, he would discover that the place of opportunity was more mysterious and complicated than he had imagined. Through those memories, he still needed to spend a great deal of effort to obtain the specific essence of that land of fortuitous encounter that he wanted to obtain. If he wanted to deduce the safe method to escape the place of opportunity, he clearly needed the specific essence. That was why he had spent a longer time than he had expected. He had used up a full 3 years before he could truly obtain a safe method to escape from this place. It's a pity that I didn't personally go to the place of opportunity. Even though I've already done my best, the chances of me being safe are still only 99%. Luo Fan sighed. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of the cave abode that the 7th tribulation expert had opened up in the city. At this moment, the 7th tribulation expert had clearly sensed his arrival. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of Luo Fan. His face was filled with anticipation as he asked, "Have you already deduced the safe method to escape?" Although I've already deduced it, because I didn't personally enter, the safety method that I deduced is actually a little unworthy of its name. In the end, the chances of absolute safety are only 99%. As for the remaining 10%, I'm afraid that you will still be injured, Luo Fan said with some shame. 10% chance of injury? Will it be fatal? The 7th tribulation expert frowned and asked. If the 10% chance of injury was fatal, then he might not necessarily dare to use this method to escape the place of opportunity. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "It won't be fatal. I've already done my best to prioritize survival. Even if there's the final chance of danger, it will still be able to protect your life. Even if it's just an ordinary creature that isn't at your level, it will definitely be able to survive." Chapter 2554. In the end, when the light of heaven and earth behind Luo Fan was covered with countless cracks, the pressure was relieved. www. Then, a figure appeared at the place he was paying attention to. Or rather, it appeared at the place where his light of heaven and earth was the strongest. This figure was none other than the 7th tribulation expert who had made a deal with Luo Fan. Of course, he was just a 7th tribulation expert in the past. Now that he had reappeared here, his cultivation had already weakened to the level of a 5th tribulation expert. Compared to before, he was tens of thousands of times weaker. When the two were put together, it was hard to believe that they were the same person. "It seems that you've succeeded." At this moment, Luo Fan appeared in front of the cultivator and said in a strange tone. The cultivator was slightly at a loss, and it took him a while to recover. He said, "I didn't expect it to be so smooth. I was planning to pay a price." Obviously, the 99% chance of safety that Luo Fan had mentioned before worked. Although the cultivator had followed the method of leaving the place of opportunity taught by Luo Fan, he did not touch the remaining 1% chance of safety. Instead, he touched the 99% chance of safety. He returned to the Tao Master's path and returned to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the person who appeared here was obviously his real body. On the surface, his cultivation realm had fallen by 2 levels, and he had become a 5 tribulation expert, but that was only on the surface. At least, it only showed that he was a 5 tribulation expert. In reality, all of his abilities, all of his power, all of his cultivation were still the same as before. In fact, they were even slightly stronger than before. In other words, he was still a 7 tribulation expert and was still qualified to enter the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. As long as he was willing. Seeing his performance, Luo Fan knew in his heart that his guess was correct. Using that method, he could indeed go against the Tao Master's path and return to the level he had experienced before. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan was deep in thought. He even wanted to let this 7 tribulation expert try to mobilize his own power and display a power that surpassed that of a 5th tribulation expert. If he displayed a higher level of strength, then there were obviously 2 possibilities. First, they would directly ascend to a higher level because of the excessively powerful strength they displayed. Secondly, there was no reaction at all. The path of the Tao Master had completely accepted him here. However, it was obvious that this was just a thought. The 7 tribulation expert in front of him was not his disciple, nor was he his test subject. He was merely a traitor. How could he agree to such a thing that would only bring him harm and no benefits? If he dared to suggest such a thing, the other party would probably blacklist him in an instant. How long did fellow Taoists stay in that land of opportunity? Luo Fan asked. About 3 trillion years. The 7 tribulation expert sighed and said to Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan instantly understood why the other party had such a blank expression in his eyes when he first appeared. 3 trillion years was not a period of time that could be ignored, even for a practitioner at this level. During such a long period of time, it was normal for him to be at a loss and be unable to recover his spirit. However, this kind of mental change was naturally meaningless to Luo Fan. At this time, he just asked, why did fellow Taoists take such a long time? This 7th tribulation expert was not Fairy Jiayu and her son from before. The reason Fairy Jiayu and her son entered the land of opportunity was to find Taoist Tixin. Under such circumstances, it would not be surprising if it took a long time. Even if it took billions of trillion years, it could only be said that they were unlucky at most. However, this was not the case for the 7th tribulation expert. When he entered the land of opportunity, he only treated it as a transit. It was normal for him to come out as soon as he entered. Even if he was delayed due to some accident, it would only be a few hundred or a few thousand years at most. How could he have been delayed for as long as 3 trillion years? The 7th tribulation expert only smiled bitterly and said, "It's nothing. I just underestimated that land of opportunity. I was imprisoned in a forbidden area for so many years. Fortunately, I had the escape method that fellow Taoists created. Otherwise, I'm afraid that I still wouldn't be able to get out." Hearing this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He already understood why the other party had been delayed in the land of opportunity for so long. In fact, this cultivator did not set his goal on the transit after entering the land of opportunity. In other words, he did not really put all his plans on this aspect. He had more ideas about the opportunities contained in the land of opportunity. After entering the land of opportunity, he had obviously spent a lot of time adventuring in the land of opportunity to find the opportunities that existed there. During one of his adventures, he was unlucky and was imprisoned by something like a trap. Furthermore, he was imprisoned for as long as 3 trillion years. Based on his understanding of the cultivator in front of him, even though he was imprisoned, he was not someone who would easily give up. After that, he must have thought of all means to break through. He used all the methods he could think of and all the power he could use in order to break out of the confinement and continue searching for opportunities. However, in the end, he was unable to do so even after 3 trillion years. In the end, when he could not think of any other way, he could only use the method that Luo Fan taught him to enter the land of opportunity to escape. I see. Looks like fellow Taoist is unlucky. Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, with a thought the countless roots of the light of heaven and earth that permeated the entire forbidden area completely retracted and returned to his light of heaven and earth. With the return of the roots, the cracks on the light of heaven and earth began to heal quickly. In the blink of an eye, it had completely recovered. On the surface, it looked as if nothing had happened. However, it was obvious that it was only on the surface. After all, the light of heaven and earth was just the light of heaven and earth. It was not the real great heaven and earth, nor was it the path to becoming a Tao master. In the face of such serious damage, it obviously needed enough time to recover and nourish. It was conceivable that there would still be many hidden dangers in the light of heaven and earth in the next period of time. They had to wait for enough time and expend enough energy before they could completely disappear. Luo Fan was naturally aware of this change, but no one else could see it at all. At this moment, the seventh tribulation expert watched as Luo Fan retracted the roots and was lost in thought. Fellow Taoist, why are you doing this? Did something abnormal happen when I returned just now? The seventh tribulation expert was obviously someone who would ask questions whenever he thought of it. Hearing this, Luo Fan just said, "When you returned, you guided the power of the land of opportunity over the same time. If I didn't have some tricks up my sleeve, I'm afraid the entire forbidden area would have collapsed by now." Hearing this, the seventh tribulation expert was slightly stunned and said, "Is that so? Doesn't that mean that every time we come to the land of opportunity, we are risking our lives?" The seventh tribulation expert was very clear about the consequences of the collapse of the forbidden area. At that time, he would be directly suppressed by the Tao Master's prison as soon as he appeared on the Tao Master's path. In that case, wouldn't all his previous plans be for naught? Luo Fan nodded and said, "You can say that. If it weren't for me." The seventh tribulation expert suddenly asked, "For what you said, the pressure this time should be much greater than the last time, right?" The last time he was referring to was naturally the movement caused by the return of Taoist He Xian and his family. It should be known that although the previous movement was not small, Luo Fan did not take much action because of it. This time, however, Luo Fan spread the roots throughout the forbidden area. This was obviously a stronger defense, which obviously meant that the movement this time was much greater than the last time. Luo Fan nodded and said, "That's right. Then I don't know if it will be stronger every time, or if it is because you have improved the method of leaving that the movement has become stronger." The seven tribulation expert said meaningfully. Hearing this, Luo Fan's eyes flashed, and he instantly understood what he meant. He immediately smiled and said, "It seems that you still haven't forgotten about that trap." When the seventh tribulation expert heard this, he could not help but feel a little embarrassed. The reason why he said this before was obviously to encourage Luo Fan to let him try again, to see if the power of the return increased because of the number of times or because of the change in the method of leaving. Since he had been exposed by Luo Fan, he had no intention of denying it. He just said, "I do have this idea. What do you think? I'm also a little curious. However, I have another idea that I want you to cooperate with. If you are willing to cooperate, I am willing to cooperate with you." Luo Fan said with a smile. He had originally thought that the idea he had before was just wishful thinking, and it was impossible for him to carry it out. However, from the looks of it now, the other party also had the intention to re-enter the place of opportunity, and this made it possible for him to carry out his original wishful thinking. When the seventh tribulation expert heard this, a faint smile appeared on his face, as if he was vaguely relieved. Originally, he also thought that his request was to force Luo Fan to cooperate, but now that Luo Fan also wanted him to cooperate, this hit it off and the two of them could work together for a win-win situation. Without this convenience, if he wanted Luo Fan to cooperate with him, he really did not know what price he would have to pay to get Luo Fan to cooperate with him. That is naturally not a problem. If you have any ideas, I will definitely cooperate, the seventh tribulation expert said with a smile. As he spoke, it seemed that he was about to take action immediately. When Luo Fan saw this, he hurriedly stopped him and said, "Even if you want to carry it out, you have to wait for a while. Just now, when I cooperated with you, my light of heaven and earth was quite damaged, and I can't do it again in a short period of time." Hearing this, the seventh tribulation expert could not help but feel a little disappointed. However, he also understood Luo Fan and did not ask about it in detail. He only nodded and said, "In that case, let's wait for a while. I will stay in the cave from now on. Once fellow Taoist is ready, come find me." Luo Fan naturally nodded and agreed. Just as the seventh tribulation expert was about to leave, he suddenly thought of something and said, "I see that fellow Taoist is quite interested in the situation of that land of fortune. Perhaps the memories of my experience this time will be of some use to fellow Taoist, so I will give them to fellow Taoist." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. A ball of light that was like the sun appeared in his hand and floated toward Luo Fan. Luo Fan was indeed somewhat interested in this, but it was not as great as before. After all, he already had the memories of his family of 3 that he had obtained from Taoist Tixien. The memories of this 7 tribulation expert were just icing on the cake. However, since the 7 tribulation expert had given it to him without asking for anything, he naturally would not hold back. In any case, although these memories were not too useful, they were still of some help. If he could combine them with the memories that he had obtained before, he might be able to obtain more information about the land of fortune that he could not obtain from Taoist Tixien's memories. He immediately thanked the 7th tribulation expert and accepted the spiritual light. As the spiritual light entered his hand, an unknown amount of information poured into his heart. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan completely absorbed this information and obtained most of the experiences of this 7 tribulation expert in the land of fortune. Of course, it was only the general details of the land of fortuitous opportunity, and only a portion of the memories that were true. As for the specifics, there was nothing about the secrets of this 7th tribulation expert. At this moment, the 7th tribulation expert had already returned to his cave abode. The area in front of Luo Fan had become empty again, and there was no one left. Seeing this, Luo Fan shook his head and turned to leave, rushing back to his cave abode. At this moment, a wave of aura rushed towards Luo Fan's location from all directions. It was as if there were many figures rushing towards him. Sensing these auras, Luo Fan frowned. These were clearly the cultivators who had been paying attention to the 7 tribulation experts' return and had used other dimensions to investigate the entire forbidden area. Chapter 25:55. In the face of their arrival, Luo Fan originally wanted to ignore them. However, after thinking about it, if he completely ignored them at this time, they would still come again in the future. Moreover, if he ignored them at this time, it would even make them dissatisfied, and at that time, it would only add to their troubles. Thus, after thinking about it, he stopped outside his cave abode and waited for the arrival of these cultivators. Very soon, the 7th tribulation cultivators appeared in front of Luo Fan. These 7th tribulation cultivators were also aura incarnations. After they appeared, their bodies emitted an aura that could freeze time and space, causing the forbidden area to lose its function. This aura indicated their identity. It let Luo Fan clearly know that they were not 6 tribulation cultivators, nor were they 5th tribulation cultivators. After these cultivators arrived, they discovered each other's existence, and each of them had a faint smile on their faces. Just one of them alone was enough pressure on Luo Fan. Now that the number of people had increased, the pressure on Luo Fan would definitely be even greater. In this way, their original plan would naturally have a greater chance of success. Immediately, an extremely thin 7th tribulation cultivator said, "Greetings, fellow cultivator." The others also bowed slightly towards Luo Fan. Of course, although they were bowing, their attitude towards Luo Fan was still concealing some sort of arrogance. It was as if a high and mighty god was showing humility to an ant. Faced with this kind of attitude, Luo Fan felt displeased. However, he didn't lose his temper and only said indifferently, "Fellow cultivators, greetings. May I ask what you are here for?" The 7th tribulation cultivators all smiled faintly. In the end, it was still the thin 7th tribulation cultivator who said, I want to exchange with fellow cultivator the method to enter the place of opportunity that fellow cultivator Wui came out of. The fellow Wui he mentioned was obviously the seventh tribulation expert who had made a deal with Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan only faintly smiled and said, "My apologies. That method of safely leaving requires my cooperation, and every time I cooperate, I suffer great losses. My transaction with Taoist Wui has just ended, and I need to spend a lot of time to recover from my injuries. I cannot continue the transaction with you." Those seven tribulation experts were just preparing what kind of reward they should give to Luo Fan. Some of them even felt that with so many people present, they might be able to achieve their goal by paying a lower price. However, they didn't expect Luo Fan to directly reject them at this moment. That sour feeling was indescribable. "Fellow Taoist, are you joking?" The skinny seventh tribulation cultivator frowned. As he spoke, his aura suddenly rose slightly. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he had turned from a kitten into a ferocious tiger. The feeling he gave off was completely different from before. This kind of aura was extremely terrifying. When it leaked out, it caused the entire forbidden area to tremble under this aura. All the cultivators could clearly feel that a certain existence that they couldn't resist was already angry at this moment. Luo Fan frowned and snorted coldly. "If fellow Taoist has no intention of exchanging, then please leave. Don't show off your power here." His words caused the expressions of the surrounding seventh tribulation cultivators to greatly change. Originally, they barely treated Luo Fan as an equal only because Luo Fan had resources that they didn't have, and his strength was comparable to their aura avatars. No matter what, they still had some thoughts of praising Luo Fan in the bottom of their hearts. Now that they were blocked by an existence that thought that they were praising Luo Fan and that only Luo Fan was qualified to communicate with them, it went without saying how they felt. A strong anger directly emerged in the hearts of these cultivators, causing their expressions to become grave. If it weren't for the fact that their relatives and friends were still in the continent of the tall tower, and that they still had to act according to Luo Fan's mood, they might have already attacked Luo Fan to teach him a lesson. Does fellow Taoists think that we are ants under fellow Taoist command? The skinny seventh tribulation cultivator said faintly. His expression showed a kind of suppressed anger, like a volcano that was already brewing and was about to explode. The other seventh tribulation cultivators also looked at Luo Fan coldly. Their attitude was no different from that of the skinny seventh tribulation cultivator. Luo Fan sneered and said, "Could it be that you want to force me?" As he said this, the entire forbidden area began to surge. There was a vague and terrifying power brewing in the forbidden area. It could explode at any time, directly destroying everything in the forbidden area, including the continent of the tall tower. Seeing this scene, Taoist Wui, who was also the seventh tribulation cultivator who had made a deal with Luo Fan before, sensed something. His expression suddenly changed, and he shouted coldly, "Fellow Taoists, what do you want to do? Do you want to become the public enemy of all fellow Taoists here?" The shout was like rolling thunder, directly causing the light in this area to seem to be minced, turning into endless light spots that began to float around. It took a long time for the light spots to recover. Under the impact of the sound waves, the aura avatars of the seven tribulation powerhouses were faintly unable to withstand it. A subtle illusory feeling appeared on these aura avatars, as if they were about to collapse. Faced with such a situation, the seventh tribulation cultivators' faces turned ugly. They didn't expect that Luo Fan would so decisively use the threat of mutual destruction, completely disregarding their anger and the anger of the cultivators who had also made a deal with him. This tough attitude made them feel extremely troubled, and they didn't know how to deal with Luo Fan. In the end, a female seventh tribulation cultivator said to Luo Fan, "Fellow Taoist, please don't be angry. This time, we are in the wrong. We apologize. Please forgive us." As she spoke, she bowed to Luo Fan, but her attitude was still decent. The expressions of the other seventh tribulation cultivators also changed slightly, and they also apologized. For these seventh tribulation cultivators, with their experience and ability, they naturally thought what they pretended to think. At this time, if they wanted to show a sincere attitude, their attitude was naturally acceptable. Luo Fan's expression was calm, and he gradually withdrew his means to the entire forbidden area. He looked coldly at the seventh tribulation cultivators and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave." As he spoke, he was about to leave. At this time, the woman turned to Luo Fan and said, "Fellow Taoist, please wait a moment." Since fellow Taoist said that we need fellow Taoist cooperation for that method to work, I wonder if fellow Taoist still needs our help. The other seventh tribulation cultivators also showed expressions of anticipation. Obviously, they were looking forward to Luo Fan's answer. They had all seen how Luo Fan cooperated with Taoist Wui. After calming down, they no longer doubted that Taoist Wui needed Luo Fan's cooperation to leave the place of opportunity. However, even if they understood this, they didn't plan to give up on the deal with Luo Fan. They didn't plan to give up on entering the place of opportunity. After all, it was a place of fortuitous encounters created by numerous large worlds. The amount of fortuitous encounters contained within them went without saying. Even though they were seventh tribulation cultivators, they were extremely tempted by this kind of opportunity. Not to mention that their relatives and friends were still suffering in the continent of the Tall Tower. When they transcended the continent of the Tall Tower, if they didn't pass through the place of opportunity, they would still be separated from their relatives and friends in the future. They would be on different levels of the Tao Master's path. Under such circumstances, the idea of wanting to be together with each other was similarly impossible. It was precisely because of this reason that they had some conflicts with Luo Fan at this time. They also wanted to obtain a safe way to enter and exit from Luo Fan's hands. Hearing this, Luo Fan just said indifferently, "Of course not. Fellow Taoists, didn't you see that my light of heaven and earth was almost completely extinguished? Even my light of heaven and earth suffered such an impact. You don't have much connection with my forbidden area. So how can you do what my light of heaven and earth did?" The seventh tribulation woman frowned and said, "Does it have to be in this forbidden area?" What she asked was naturally where they would land after leaving the place of opportunity. Normally, this kind of landing point naturally didn't need to be fixed in one place. At least according to the knowledge of the seven tribulation experts, this kind of landing point should be chosen at will, and it could be in any area of this world. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally shook his head and said, "Of course not. But I know that in other places, the impact will be even greater and the movement will be even more terrifying. It will be even more difficult to cooperate." "I see." The seven tribulation experts looked at each other, as if they had some ideas. Very soon, the seven tribulation cultivators had finished exchanging their opinions. The female tribulation cultivator said, "If we don't need your cooperation, would you be willing to make a deal with us?" "Don't need my cooperation?" Luo Fan looked at the seventh tribulation experts with a strange expression. His heart stirred slightly, but he had already figured out the thoughts of these seven tribulation experts. Obviously, they planned to work together to build a safe landing point, and then use the method of leaving the place of opportunity taught by Luo Fan to leave the place of opportunity and come to the landing point. In this way, they didn't need Luo Fan's cooperation, and they could safely experience the place of opportunity together and directly go against the Tao Master's path and truly step into the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Luo Fan secretly disdained their idea because he knew that the possibility of failure was quite high. Although Luo Fan had used his light of heaven and earth to completely stabilize the forbidden area, so that it didn't collapse because of the power of the place of opportunity, it was only because his light of heaven and earth was many times more powerful than the light of heaven and earth of an ordinary fifth tribulation expert, or even sixth or seventh tribulation expert. It was almost impossible for an ordinary cultivator, even a seventh tribulation expert, to do what Luo Fan had done. Apart from this, even if all of these prerequisites were removed, assuming that the seven tribulation powerhouses really had the ability to create such a place that could withstand the power of the land of fortuitous encounters. But it didn't mean that they would succeed. After all, what they wanted was to enter the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. And here, seven tribulation experts like them had all sneaked in. This identity made it impossible for them to use their full strength. Even if they attacked, they had to carefully hide themselves, not daring to let the Tao Master's path sense their essence and discover their existence. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to build a structure that could withstand the power of the place of opportunity, and if they wanted to create a place where they could stay, it was imaginable how much power they would need to expend and how big of a commotion they would need to cause. And once they caused such a commotion, the Tao Master's prison would definitely descend. If that was the case, they would probably be sealed by the Tao Master's prison before they could even enter the place of opportunity. At that moment, he said, "Everyone, have you thought it through?" When the seventh tribulation cultivators heard Luo Fan's words, they secretly rejoiced in their hearts. This clearly meant that there was room for discussion. They all revealed calm smiles and said, "Naturally, we have already thought about it. We don't need fellow Taoist cooperation. We only need fellow Taoists to give us the method to leave. Since you have thought it through, it's naturally not a problem, as long as you don't regret it in the future," Luo Fan said calmly. At this time, the seven tribulation experts all had faint smiles on their faces. They didn't take Luo Fan's doubts to heart at all. They even thought that Luo Fan was a frog at the bottom of a well. He didn't know how powerful the seventh tribulation experts were, and how terrifying their real strength would be. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally had nothing to say. He immediately said to the seventh tribulation experts, "In that case, you only need to give me a magic treasure of the seventh level of the Tao Master's path." Hearing this, the expressions on the faces of the seventh tribulation experts froze. Chapter 25:56. These seven tribulation experts fell into hesitation at this time. Seeing their hesitation, Luo Fan had no intention of interrupting at all. He just looked at them indifferently, waiting for their decision. The price was here. If they agreed, they agreed. If they didn't, then forget it. Anyway, he was not in a hurry to make a deal. These seven tribulation experts pondered for a long time and finally agreed one by one. After all, the value of a safe way to enter and exit a place of opportunity was too great. For seventh tribulation experts like them, it was extremely difficult to make progress. It was too common for them to be stuck in a bottleneck for hundreds of millions of years. Under such circumstances, a place of opportunity was almost equivalent to a chance to break through. It could help them break through the bottleneck that had been shackling them for hundreds of millions of years. Its value could be imagined. In contrast, the seventh tribulation primordial origin spiritual treasure was also quite valuable, but it was nothing. After thinking about this, the decision of these seven tribulation experts was not surprising at all. Seeing these seven tribulation experts agree one by one, Luo Fan did not feel very happy. On the contrary, he became dignified. It seems that the cultivation of the seventh level of the road of Tao Master is more difficult than I thought. This was the thought that appeared in his mind at this moment. The reason why he made such a judgment was naturally because these seven tribulation experts so readily agreed to his demand, which was like a ripoff. He was very clear about how precious a seventh tribulation primordial origin spiritual treasure was. The time needed to successfully refine a seventh tribulation primordial origin spiritual treasure was definitely not any shorter than any practitioner who wanted to become a seventh tribulation expert. More importantly, because of the uniqueness of the magic treasure, the time needed was several times or even more than 10 times longer. Just by looking at this sacrificial time, one could already see how difficult it was. Not to mention, if a practitioner wanted to transfer his own way of cultivation to the magic treasure, he would need to further understand his own way of cultivation, and even need to carry out a corresponding transformation of his own way of cultivation. Compared to the time it would take, the difficulty was not much different. In this way, any 7th Tribulation powerhouse who wanted to refine a 7th Tribulation primordial origin spiritual treasure would need to spend a lot of time and energy, enough to make any 6th Tribulation powerhouse feel despair. But at this time, every 7th Tribulation powerhouse that appeared actually had an extra 7th Tribulation level primordial essence spirit treasure. In other words, these 7th Tribulation powerhouses had at least refined more than one primordial origin spiritual treasure. If they didn't have extra primordial origin spiritual treasures, how could they be willing to hand over these primordial origin spiritual treasures after such a short consideration? It was already so difficult to refine a 7th Tribulation level primordial essence spirit treasure. If one wanted to refine multiple of them, then the difficulty was self-evident. Since they had the time and energy to refine extra primordial essence spirit treasures, it obviously meant that during the cultivation of the 7th level of the Tao Master's path, there had to be at least several times where they couldn't find any hope of breaking through, no direction of breaking through, and no possibility of breaking through. No one knew how many trillions of years it would be possible. From this, it could be seen how difficult it was for them to cultivate in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He understood why there were so many ways to enter certain places of opportunity in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. He was afraid that it was absolutely necessary. Without the help of so many places of opportunity, it would be almost impossible for a practitioner to make progress in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. With all these thoughts in mind, on the surface, Luo Fan just nodded calmly and watched these 7 Tribulation experts use various means to summon the 7 Tribulation level primordial essence spirit treasure from their real bodies to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. It was not easy to summon the 7 Tribulation level primordial essence spirit treasures from their real bodies to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Perhaps, because of the special nature of magic treasures, this kind of summoning was much less costly than the Aura Doppelganger, but it was not much less. If they wanted to pay such a high price to summon these magic treasures, the movement would naturally not be small. At this time, these 7 Tribulation experts all looked awe-inspiring. In front of Luo Fan, they stirred up their power and used all kinds of subtle means to cooperate with their real bodies to open the retrograde channels. Then, one by one, the seemingly ordinary magic treasures gradually sank down from the channels and slowly appeared in the hands of the 7 Tribulation experts. Each of these magic treasures was faintly discernible with indescribable mystery. However, at least on the surface, there was nothing special about them. If a cultivator with poor eyesight looked at them, he might think that they were ordinary things. These magic treasures were different in appearance, but they had one thing in common. That was, they were not in the shape of combat weapons. Each magic treasure looked like a variety of daily necessities. Luo Fan even saw a magic treasure that looked like a comb among them. Obviously, although these 7 Tribulation experts had agreed to trade the 7 Tribulation level primordial essence spirit treasures with Luo Fan, they did not have the idea of strengthening Luo Fan's combat effectiveness. When choosing magic treasures, they deliberately excluded those that could be used for combat. Of course, seeing this scene, Luo Fan did not feel unhappy in his heart. On the contrary, he felt that it was better to do so. To him, compatibility wasn't that important. After all, his combat methods relied on his own worldview and the various magical powers, principles, and mysteries that he had comprehended. As for using magic treasures to fight, he had not done it for many years. Moreover, more importantly, he had always thought that magic treasures were external objects. No matter how strong the power of magic treasures was, it was only temporary to him. It could not last long. Compared to combat, what he wanted more were all kinds of auxiliary magic treasures. Magic treasures that could assist him in cultivation and research. With this mentality, the magic treasures that these 7 Tribulation experts gave him, which were obviously not used for combat, were more to his liking. Of course, he naturally could not say much about this. At this moment, When he saw these magic treasures, he only frowned slightly. Apart from that, he did not show any other reaction, as if he was not very satisfied with these magic treasures. However, the seven tribulation experts acted as if they did not see this at all. They handed over the magic treasures to Luo Fan to complete the transaction. Luo Fan received a magic treasure and gave a ball of spiritual light to someone. Just like that, in just a few short days, he already had 13 seventh tribulation, pseudo, primordial origin spiritual treasures in his hands. In addition to the ruler that Taoist Wui had given him before, he already had 14 seventh tribulation pseudo, primordial origin spiritual treasures. If these magic treasures could be used for combat, he was afraid that just these magic treasures alone would be enough to crush the true body of a seven tribulation expert to death. However, it was a pity that these seven tribulation experts seemed to have agreed that none of the magic treasures could be used for combat. Even the ruler that Taoist Wui gave them could only be used to rub the edges. Regarding this, the cultivators and Luo Fan had a tacit understanding that they did not say much. The cultivators naturally did not say anything because this kind of thing was simply not good to say. If they said it, it would not look good on them. On the other hand, Luo Fan did not say much because he naturally did not want others to know his thoughts. He did not want those cultivators to think that he had suffered a loss. Fellow Taoists, please remember that the landing point cannot be set in this forbidden area. Luo Fan finally he said to the seven tribulation experts. At this moment, the seven tribulation experts were carefully examining the method of entering and leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them. Their faces showed a rather strange expression. They seemed to be somewhat worried, but also vaguely seemed to have a strong sense of confidence. With one look, they knew that the method of entering and leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them was somewhat beyond their expectations. However, they still had confidence that their plan would succeed. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the cultivators nodded their heads. They only wanted to reassure Luo Fan. Seeing that they seemed to not care, Luo Fan frowned and said again, "Everyone, do not take this matter lightly. The method that I have given you requires the cooperation of this side. I'm very clear about the various details required. This time, after you enter the land of opportunity, I will adjust the various structures of this forbidden area. At that time, if you place the landing point here, you will definitely fail." Hearing this, the cultivators frowned one by one, and the way they looked at Luo Fan became unfriendly. Based on Luo Fan's attitude, it was clear that he did not believe in their promise. He wanted to fundamentally cut off the possibility of them placing the landing point in this forbidden area. Fellow Taoist, do you think that we will not keep our promise? One of the cultivators said unhappily at this moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan only shook his head indifferently and said, "Everyone, please don't blame me. It's not that I don't believe you, but this matter is of great importance. If you place the landing point here, and I am unable to cooperate with you, everything in this forbidden area will be destroyed. At that time, I'm afraid that your friends and relatives will also be destroyed, so I have to be careful." The seven tribulation powerhouses were still quite unhappy when they heard this. After all, Luo Fan still did not believe in them. It was just that he did not believe in their character, and he did not believe in their strength. If he really believed in their strength, he would know that with their strength, it would be very easy for them to protect this forbidden area. Even if they placed the landing point here, with the help of others, they would definitely be able to guard this forbidden area easily. However, at this time, since Luo Fan had already said so, they could not pester him endlessly. After all, they had already agreed before the transaction. At that moment, these cultivators nodded one by one, turned around, and left without saying anything. After that, they would obviously study the method of leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them. They would discuss with each other how to open a landing point to withstand the terrifying power of the land of opportunity when they left the land of opportunity. This kind of discussion, naturally, had nothing to do with Luo Fan. After they left, Luo Fan just sneered to himself, turned around, and entered his cave residence. He directly closed his cave residence and no longer cared about the outside world. After those 7 tribulation powerhouses left, they each spent decades studying the method of leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them. The more they studied, the more they admired him. This method of leaving the land of opportunity was not only complicated, but the most important thing was that it had considered all aspects of the situation clearly. There were already corresponding countermeasures to deal with any of the possible accidents that might occur. It could be said that even if they did not study this method and simply followed it, there was a 99% chance of safety. As a cultivator at the 5th level of the road of Dao Master, even they had to admire him for being able to study such an exquisite method. They felt that they had underestimated Luo Fan. However, as they studied it, they became more and more confident that they could safely leave the land of opportunity. It must be known that the things Luo Fan had described in that method were too specific and perfect. With their ability, they had studied it for decades and had already thoroughly studied every detail of it. They thought that even if they wanted to change it and adjust it according to the corresponding land of opportunity, they would have a considerable chance of success. Under such circumstances, it was self-evident what they thought about this method. On this day, the 13 7 tribulation experts contacted each other and knew the progress of each other's research. They immediately gathered in one place, ready to communicate and see the results of each other's research. Even if they had sufficient confidence, they were still 7 tribulation experts, existences that had cultivated for who knows how many trillions of years. Caution was something that they would never lack. Even if they were sure that their research was not wrong, even if they were sure that their understanding of that method was absolutely deep enough to allow them to safely build a landing point and leave the land of opportunity, they still would not let go of the opportunity to increase their chances of success. They would not give up the possibility of obtaining nourishment from other cultivators. Chapter 2557. The 13 7 tribulation experts originally did not have much friendship, but after the transaction with Luo Fan, their positions have been unified. Novels with such a unified stance, they naturally formed a foundation for friendship. When they communicated, it was not much different from the communication between cultivators who had good relationships with each other. In just a few days, they had already unified each other's ideas and had their own ideas about how to open up the place to stay. They even had a general discussion about how to enter the place of opportunity and how to leave it. Although they did not think that their methods were worse than Luo Fan's, they did not think that only Luo Fan's methods could make the way to leave the place of opportunity safe. However, they would not become arrogant because of this, nor would they lose their vigilance because of this. After discussing with each other, they would create a place to stay, and then all of them would enter the place of opportunity and take the risk together. They would not do such a thing no matter what. First, some of them would enter the place of opportunity, and the rest would stay here to cooperate. This was the method they would choose. After the discussion, the 7 tribulation experts left the forbidden area in a flash and directly appeared in an ordinary void outside the forbidden area that was shrouded in light. At a glance, there were endless stars in the starry sky. These stars existed in the void in an extremely wondrous manner, existing in the boundless sea of light. They were like strange gems. Looking at the strange scenery in the 5th level of the Dao Master's path, these cultivators all had inexplicable expressions of nostalgia. It should be known that each of these cultivators had experienced the 5th level of the Dao Master's path before. For them, everything in the 5th level of the Dao Master's path was a memory from a very long time ago, and it represented a certain period of their past lives. At this moment, looking at the familiar 5th level of the Dao Master's path from this perspective, they naturally felt quite complicated. A 7th tribulation expert was the first to regain his senses and said to the other cultivators, "This is indeed the most suitable place for us to carry out the transformation." His words brought the other cultivators back to their senses, and they began to investigate their surroundings. Originally, they had already roughly investigated the inside and outside of this place before coming here. However, that was only a rough investigation after all. If they wanted to confirm that there were no problems with this place, and that it was the most suitable for them to modify it, they still had to come here personally and personally investigate all the details in this place before they could be truly sure. At this time, they carefully investigated and found that the situation here was even more perfect than what they had roughly investigated before. The entire structure was almost completely born according to the landing point that they had deduced. If they wanted to completely reconstruct the foothold, the changes they needed to make were a little less than they had imagined. Faced with this situation, the cultivators were naturally delighted. All the emotions they had felt before were instantly tossed aside. They began to discuss and assign tasks to each other. Then, they dispersed and began to modify the environment bit by bit. Due to the fact that they were unable to unleash their powers wantonly to transform the environment, their transformation of this location was rather slow. The entire transformation process, which could have been completed with just a thought, took them thousands of years to barely construct a prototype. If it weren't for the fact that they were all 7 tribulation experts and were extremely patient, they might have been irritated after wasting so much time and started to do something that Luo Fan didn't want to see. On this day, as they were remodeling this area, a strange fluctuation suddenly came from afar. You still said that it can't be restored in a short period of time. A 7th tribulation expert frowned with an inexplicable ugly expression on his face. The other 7 tribulation experts' expressions also changed slightly at this moment, and they were also quite dissatisfied. Evidently, they all sensed that something that they were unhappy with was going on in the forbidden area in the distance. In the forbidden area, Luo Fan had already left his cave abode and arrived outside Taoist Wui's cave abode in the city. When he arrived, Taoist Wui, who had been waiting for a long time, noticed his arrival. His figure flashed and appeared in front of Luo Fan. When Taoist Wui saw Luo Fan, a look of anticipation appeared on his face as he asked, "Has Taoist Wui recovered from his injuries?" "That's right. I wonder if Taoist Wui is ready," Luo Fan said with a smile. After thousands of years of recovery, his light of heaven and earth had completely recovered to its peak state. Even the slightest bit of damage had been completely repaired. At this moment, his light of heaven and earth was complete and flawless. It could almost be called a synonym for perfection. "Of course I'm ready. I can start at any time." Taoist Wui smiled slightly. The aura on his body seemed to be extremely strong at this moment, and the strength of a 5th tribulation expert began to show itself. Waves of aura began to spread in all directions. As this aura spread, it produced a subtle fluctuation that spread far and wide and was sensed by many cultivators on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. The fluctuation that the 13 cultivators who had built a foothold outside the forbidden area had sensed was caused by Taoist Wui's aura. As for why they were in a bad mood when they sensed this fluctuation, the reason was very simple. It was because their minds were sharp enough. Through this fluctuation, they could guess that he was about to make another deal with Luo Fan. This obviously contradicted what Luo Fan had said to them, that he would not be able to cooperate in a short period of time. This made them feel extremely unhappy. However, it was clear that this kind of contradiction was only due to the difference between their long time and Luo Fan's long time. For Luo Fan, using thousands of years to restore his light of heaven and earth was obviously not a short period of time. But for those 7 tribulation experts, what was thousands of years? Who would dare to say that it was a long period of time without hundreds of millions of years? Don't forget, these 7 tribulation powerhouses had the free time to spend countless billions of years to refine 7 tribulation level pseudo primordial origin spirit treasures one after another. Obviously, for Taoist Wui, thousands of years was not a long period of time. Because of this, when he saw Luo Fan at this time, he was so surprised and pleasantly surprised. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression was quite calm. He said, "If that's the case, then please try to remove the restrictions on cultivation and step into a higher level." Hearing this, Taoist Wui was slightly taken aback. Then, a look of realization appeared on his face. He understood Luo Fan's intention. He smiled and said, I see. I didn't think that Taoist Wui had such an intention. I really admire you. He naturally understood that Luo Fan did this because he wanted to see a deeper change in the method to leave the land of opportunity, and this was something that he did not need to do. Hearing this praise, Luo Fan only smiled and said, I was just curious. Taoist Wui only smiled and did not say anything else. With a thought, his power surged, and he instantly broke through the realm. His cultivation directly entered the level of a sixth tribulation expert. With this breakthrough, the aura on his body began to spread out in all directions, stirring up the endless light in the surroundings, causing strange vortexes to appear in the surroundings. The vortexes constantly nested, constantly collided, and finally caused the surroundings to become extremely chaotic. At this moment, a ray of light fell from the sky and directly smashed down on Taoist Wui. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but frown. Could it be that the cultivators who came out of the land of opportunity, as long as their strength surpassed the fifth tribulation level, had to ascend to the sixth level of the Tao Master's path? At this moment, Taoist Wui's body shook and the light disappeared. Taoist Wui's ascension process was interrupted. Can it change according to Taoist Wui's will? Luo Fan immediately asked. Hearing this, Taoist Wui nodded and then shook his head. He said, It's only one level difference, but not two. Just now, I already felt that it was a little difficult and I was a little repulsed. Hearing this, Luo Fan's face showed a look of realization. Then he said, Then let's try. Taoist Wui shrugged and no longer hesitated. He once again released the restrictions on his body, and his cultivation realm began to break through again. In the blink of an eye, he had crossed the huge level of the sixth tribulation expert and reached the peak of the sixth tribulation expert. At this level, he was already a level higher than Luo Fan. In front of him, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable pressure coming from his body and surging towards him. Feeling this change, Luo Fan's heart moved. As the light of heaven and earth surged, it had already enveloped his body and completely isolated the pressure. The strength of the peak of the sixth tribulation expert was not small for him, but for the light of heaven and earth, it was obviously nothing. Being enveloped by the light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan only felt a sense of relief. The terrifying pressure that had been suppressing his body previously had disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. In the face of such a situation, Taoist Wui did not care. It was as if he had not noticed Luo Fan's movements at all. Once again, he stimulated his cultivation realm and released the last bit of strength that had been suppressed in his body. In an instant, his cultivation realm broke through the limit and stepped into a level that Luo Fan still could not understand. At this moment, the entire forbidden area began to shake violently. There seemed to be a terrifying force that directly shook the entire forbidden area, causing all the light, all the power, and even all the cultivators in the forbidden area to be controlled by this force, unable to control themselves. Compared to the aura incarnation of the seven tribulation expert, compared to their doppelgangers, the aura that Taoist Wui exuded at this time was many times stronger. Under this kind of momentum, the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road seemed to become extremely small. Under this kind of terrifying impact, it seemed to have become a piece of paper constantly shaking and trembling, as if it had been glued together. This scene was so terrifying that it was difficult to control oneself. In the face of this kind of pressure, this kind of momentum, this kind of aura, even through the light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan could see the effect caused. Although the light of heaven and earth was still effective, it could still isolate all kinds of oppression. However, it was not that the light of heaven and earth itself did not change. Under this impact, the light of heaven and earth began to rapidly change shape, like a candle flame in the wind, and began to shake wildly. This kind of scene looked like it was in a precarious situation. In the face of this change, a thoughtful expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. This was the first time that he truly felt the level of the seventh tribulation expert, what kind of strength, what kind of aura, and what kind of aura it had. In this kind of feeling, he could clearly feel a mysterious existence that he had not felt before. This mysterious existence made him feel enlightened, as if he had vaguely grasped some kind of further clue, or in other words, away at this moment, a ray of light fell from the sky, directly enveloping the seventh tribulation expert, causing the figure of Taoist Wui to gradually become hazy. Sure enough, there is no way to resist. At this time, the voice of Taoist Wui sounded. There was a sense of helplessness in his voice, as well as a sense of enlightenment. Obviously, this situation also made him a little disappointed. After all, if he could safely exist in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, then from then on, he would be able to do whatever he wanted in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. Even Luo Fan could no longer restrict him, nor could he allow his will to be distorted in any way. Evidently, the current situation was not a good thing for him. Chapter 25:58. Although it was difficult to resist, Taoist Wui still tried his best to resist the ascension mechanism. He tried his best to fix himself in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Unfortunately, in the end, he could only watch helplessly as he disappeared from the fifth level and stepped directly into the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. So that's the mechanism. Watching Taoist Wui disappear, Luo Fan revealed an inexplicable smile. He felt that all the doubts in his heart had disappeared without a trace. At this moment, all the cultivators in the entire forbidden area, and even the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path, heaved a sigh of relief. Although it was only for a moment, the power that Taoist Wui exuded was enough to shock all the cultivators. At that moment, they clearly knew that as long as Taoist Wui wanted to, even if it was just for a moment, he could completely wipe out all the cultivators in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Whether it was a fifth tribulation cultivator, a sixth tribulation cultivator from the sixth level, or a seventh tribulation cultivator from the seventh level, all of them were existences that Taoist Wui could deal with in an instant. In other words, at that moment, all the cultivators knew that they had already taken a trip to the gates of hell. How could they not be nervous? How could they not relax when Taoist Wui disappeared? It turns out that returning from a land of opportunity has such a benefit. It seems that I have to go there as much as I can just to go there. This was what the aura incarnations of the seven tribulation experts who were building the foothold were thinking about at this moment. At this moment, facing such a change, Luo Fan did not care at all. He just moved his heart slightly and walked to the front of the continent of the tall tower. At this moment, there were already several cultivators who had just transcended from the continent of the tall tower. They were none other than the so-called disciples of the Tao ancestor, who were also the native cultivators of the continent of the tall tower. Their luck, perception, and aptitude couldn't compare to the native cultivators who had transcended before them. As a result, they had spent billions of years more than the native cultivators to become fifth tribulation cultivators and gain the qualifications to transcend. However, even though they had transcended, they could only wander around the continent of the tall tower. As they had not cultivated the embryonic form of heaven and earth light, they could not move freely in the endless light in the forbidden area. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that this was their final destination. For Luo Fan, although these cultivators were not his disciples, after all, they still had some kinship with him. Seeing them trapped here, he naturally could not bear it. That was why he appeared here at this time. After arriving here, he didn't wait for the cultivators to greet him. Instead, he casually sent a beam of spiritual light into their foreheads and into their hearts, letting them know all kinds of common knowledge about cultivating in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. After that, he waved his hand and sent them out of the forbidden area, directly sending them to where the Tao ancestor and the others were at that very moment. It was better to leave the matter of teaching the disciples to their masters. It's a bit troublesome to go there every time. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan waved his hand, and the endless light around the continent of the tall tower began to change subtly. Various layers began to be divided, and various complicated and mysterious structures appeared in these layers. They gradually formed an extremely complex structure that formed a rather subtle function. These complex and mysterious structures only existed in this area for a short, while before immediately disappearing without a trace, as if they had never existed in the first place. If that's the case, it should be fine. Looking at the various invisible structures around him, Luo Fan thought so. He turned around and returned to his cave residence to continue his research that had already made some progress. These hidden structures here had many uses. The most important one was to receive the native cultivators who had transcended from the tall tower continent. As long as these structures existed, once the native cultivators transcended from the tall tower continent, they would be affected by these structures and obtain some subtle information from them. They would then understand the general knowledge of cultivating in the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. After that, it would use its power to directly teleport these native cultivators out of the forbidden area to where the Tao Ancestor and the others were previously. In this way, it could be considered as giving the native cultivators a way out. Just a few years after Luo Fan left, a native cultivator transcended and appeared outside the tall tower continent out of thin air. The cultivator was a woman who looked rather ordinary. Her eyes were filled with endless vicissitudes, and one could tell at a glance that she had cultivated for countless years. Although her soul was not riddled with holes, it was difficult for her to have the vitality from before. The woman looked at the endless brilliance around her and felt the terrifying pressure that existed in all directions. She was at a loss for a moment. "This is outside the tall tower continent," she murmured, her eyes a little excited and a little disappointed. She could feel that her current location was still safe, but it was only temporary. As time passed, as her resistance continued to weaken, this place would become more and more dangerous. She tried to go in various directions, but she soon discovered that the further she went, the more dangerous the surroundings became. He could still resist the pressure for a short period of time here, but if he went outside, the pressure would quickly increase to a level that he would not be able to resist. At that time, everything that he had painstakingly cultivated to this point would be completely destroyed. At this moment, countless complex structures around her were touched, and some kind of information appeared out of thin air in her heart, allowing her to instantly understand many things. As she received this information, the vicissitudes in her eyes began to diminish at a speed visible to the naked eye. In just a few dozen breaths, her eyes were full of vitality again, and she became extremely curious. In the depths of her eyes, there was some kind of clear purity. "So, the world is actually this big," she murmured, her expression becoming excited. The reason why she felt vicissitudes was because she had stayed in the tall tower continent for far too long. After such a long period of time, she had practically witnessed all the mysteries in the continent of the tall pagoda. She had explored every inch of space in every layer of the continent of the tall pagoda. Under such circumstances, she could almost redraw the appearance of every inch of the void and the appearance of every terrain in the tall tower continent in her mind, as long as she closed her eyes. In this way, the entire Spire continent was like a huge cage to her. Everything had lost its interest and became extremely boring to her. If it was not for her own cultivation method that was sufficiently perfect and her mind that was sufficiently firm, it would have been difficult for her to break through and transcend the tall tower continent. However, at this time, after leaving the continent of the tower and obtaining the general knowledge left by Luo Fan, she suddenly found that the continent of the tower, which she had stayed in for billions of years, was just an insignificant in the whole road to becoming a Tao Master. Outside the continent of the tall tower, just this forbidden area alone was already filled with endless mysteries waiting for her to explore. Not to mention that outside the forbidden area, there was the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's Path that was billions of times larger than the forbidden area, waiting for her. In addition to that, there was also the 8th level of the Tao Master's Path outside the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. Moreover, outside the Tao Master's Path, there was also the Tao Master Universe and the unknown number of opportunities that were jointly constructed by the many universes, all of this was simply a huge subversion to her. It directly filled her originally lifeless heart with vitality, and the feeling of vicissitudes naturally dissipated along with it. At this moment, various mysterious powers appeared out of thin air and directly enveloped her body. In a flash, they had already transported her out of the forbidden area, and she fell into a settlement built by the Tao ancestor. Arriving here, the rather familiar scene in front of her made the woman's eyes flash with a trace of nostalgia. Very quickly, she sensed a familiar aura from it. "This is teacher." Her eyes revealed a kind of surprise as she said so. At this moment, the Tao ancestor's laughter was heard. "I didn't expect that in such a short period of time, you have already transcended." As he spoke, a figure appeared in front of the woman. Looking at the familiar figure in front of her, the woman's eyes instantly filled with tears. She knelt towards the figure and said, "This disciple has been lagging behind for a long time. I have made teacher worry. It's not long. It's only been less than 100 million years since we came out. How can it be considered a long time?" The figure revealed a smile at this moment. He was obviously the Tao ancestor. At this moment, he looked rather gratified as he looked at the little disciple in front of him who he had high hopes for, and felt that his life was already complete. This woman was none other than the Tao ancestor's little disciple, and also the disciple that the Tao ancestor had valued the most back then. However, perhaps because the opportunity had not arrived, or perhaps because of other reasons, when they had transcended back then, this little disciple had lagged behind. This had always been a great regret for him. If it wasn't for the fact that he still did not have the strength to return, he would have returned to the continent of the tall tower to see what had happened to her. Hearing this, the woman could not stop her tears. One must know that her teacher had always been rather indifferent, but at this moment, he actually revealed his emotions, which was enough to show how intense the changes in his emotions were. It was also enough to show how much of a regret it was for him to lag behind back then. At this moment, many cultivators appeared behind the Tao ancestor and looked at the woman with smiles. Looking at the familiar figures, the little bit of vicissitudes that remained in the woman's heart could no longer be found. With so many companions, so many senior brothers, senior sisters, junior brothers, and junior sisters, where would she have the time to think about the vicissitudes? After the greetings, several days had passed. For the cultivators who had ascended before, the time they had been apart was naturally nothing. After all, they were existences that had cultivated in the continent of the tall tower for billions of years. However, for this woman, the time they had been apart was already unimaginably long. After such a long time, if it wasn't for the woman's strong Tao heart, she might have already forgotten about their existence. With such a request, the woman naturally had countless words to say to these cultivators and the Tao ancestor. Although the Tao ancestor and the others had not been separated from the woman for long, they also knew that the time they had experienced in the continent of the tall tower must have been rather long. In such a long time, there must have been huge changes. Due to the huge changes, they were naturally interested in what the entire continent of the tall tower, which was their home, had become. In that case, among so many disciples, no one can break through anymore. The Tao ancestor sighed with a slightly dazed expression. After all, back then, he had tens of thousands of disciples under him. And now, among so many disciples, there were only a few dozen people who could truly transcend the continent of the tall tower like him. However, this number made him feel extremely disappointed. Cultivation is indeed full of difficulties. If we had relaxed a little back then, I'm afraid we would have also fallen by now. The other cultivators sighed inwardly at this moment. After all, the reason why these cultivators could transcend at this time and still follow their teacher was mainly because of their teacher's supervision and the pride in their hearts. If it weren't for that, they would have fallen into the continent of the tall tower and never been able to break through again like their other companions. I'm afraid so. I was only able to break through this time because of luck. The woman who had just transcended showed an indescribable expression at this moment. Her eyes were filled with lingering fear, joy, and an indescribable sense of gratitude. It was a kind of gratitude towards her teacher and the other senior and junior brothers. Chapter 25:59. The woman then stayed in the settlement to cultivate, working hard to improve her foundation that was left behind by cultivating in the continent of the tall tower. This kind of cultivation was extremely wonderful for her. Even if her mentality had recovered, she had, after all, been shackled in the continent of the tall pagoda for billions of years. It went without saying how much impact it had on her after being unable to find a direction to move forward for such a long time. Now that she could suddenly find a direction to break through, she could feel her progress, perfection, and sublimation at every moment. It was easy to imagine how it felt. It could be said that she had found the wonderful feeling of cultivating under her master. She devoted herself to exploring the mysteries of cultivation and the mysteries of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. She used the results of her exploration to perfect herself and make up for her shortcomings and hidden dangers. On this day, the woman's expression changed. She instantly left her cave abode and arrived at the place where she had first appeared in the settlement. By then, there were already several cultivators there. Among them was her teacher, the so-called Tao ancestor. However, apart from these familiar faces, there was also a somewhat unfamiliar but vaguely familiar face. That was because he hadn't appeared in this inhabited land before, but for her, he was already someone she was definitely familiar with. In other words, the cultivator who had just appeared in the settlement after transcending from the continent of the tall tower. I didn't expect to see the legendary Tao ancestor here. What a blessing. The cultivator said with an excited smile after seeing the Tao ancestor. I didn't expect the next generation to have grown to this level. The Tao ancestor looked at the cultivator with joy and disappointment. He was naturally happy that there was an endless stream of cultivators in his hometown who could transcend. On the other hand, he was disappointed that the people he was familiar with had really lost their hope of transcending. The cultivator's eyes turned and locked onto the woman. The moment he saw the woman, he was shocked and said, "Senior has indeed transcended." When Senior disappeared, many fellow Taoists suspected that Senior had already passed away. When the woman heard this, she smiled and said, "It was just luck." Then, she took over the Tao ancestor's job and greeted the cultivator. After all, compared to the Tao ancestor, she was more familiar with the cultivator and had more common topics to talk about. Moreover, to be honest, the status of the Tao ancestor was much higher than that of the cultivator in front of him. When the cultivator first entered this place, he showed his face and gave the cultivator some face. If he was the one to greet the cultivator, it would be slightly inappropriate. The cultivator didn't mind this kind of treatment. On the contrary, he was even more satisfied with this kind of treatment. Although the people in front of him were legendary figures and each of them had a high status in his heart, he had only heard of them in legends. However, in the end, he had only heard of these people in legends. The one he was truly familiar with was still the youngest disciple of the Tao ancestor. After receiving the cultivator naturally settled down in the settlement. At the same time, he began to perfect his own cultivation foundation, and worked hard to perfect the hidden dangers left behind by his cultivation in the Spire continent. Back then, when Luo Fan built the tall tower continent, he had already made preparations for this. The cultivators who perfected their own hidden dangers were mostly just filling in some of the vacancies that were originally empty. There weren't many who really changed, reversed, or changed their cultivation. As such, it was naturally relatively easy to make up for the hidden dangers. However, as long as there was enough time, it could be completed. There was no need for it to be as torturous as metamorphosis, and there weren't too many choices. There wouldn't be too much instability. After that, every few years, a cultivator would transcend from the tall tower continent and be transferred to the settlement that Luo Fan had prepared. However, ever since that reception, the Tao ancestor would only show up for a while and directly hand over the reception to his youngest disciple, as well as the cultivator who got to know his youngest disciple. Only a few years had passed in the outside world, but hundreds of millions of years had passed in the tall tower continent. Therefore, even if the gap was only a few years, the cultivators who transcended later were already the juniors of the cultivators who had transcended earlier. Some of them were even juniors who had transcended later. As a result, the main focus of each reception was always the first cultivator who entered this place. In the end, the woman had unknowingly become a legendary figure. One day, hundreds of years after she had entered the settlement, the woman's body trembled. She suddenly sensed that something closely related to her had been born in the distance. What the hell is it? Hundreds of years of cultivation had only made up for the woman's hidden dangers. At this time, the woman had not made much progress compared to when she had just transcended. With such strength, there were many restrictions on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Not to mention the forbidden areas, she couldn't even safely travel to some of the more special starry skies. It was precisely because of this that she hadn't thought of leaving the settlement to travel the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's path for the time being. However, this time, there was a strong impulse in her heart, an impulse to travel the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. This impulse was so strong that she couldn't suppress it at all. What the hell is going on? Why would I suddenly have such an idea? The woman was secretly shocked and puzzled. While suppressing the impulse in her heart, she thought to herself. At this time, a figure rushed out of the settlement and directly left the settlement. It was thinking about the direction where the woman had sensed the birth of the thing related to her information. It was because another cultivator had sensed a similar change and headed toward that place before she did. Feeling this change, how could the woman hold back? At this moment, she took a step and was already out of her cave residence. Just as she was about to say goodbye to her teacher, she suddenly froze. This was because her teacher was floating quietly in the void at this time. Looking at his slightly trembling body, it seemed that he was suppressing something. And not far from her teacher, the Tao ancestor, there were also many cultivators floating there, and they were also doing their best to suppress something. Seeing this scene, how could she not know that the thing that she had sensed and was closely related to her was not right? Teacher, what the hell is going on? I feel that something that is closely related to me has been born in that direction. The woman came to the air and asked the Tao ancestor. At this time, the Tao ancestor was still trying his best to suppress something. When he saw the woman coming up, he was slightly stunned. You only sense this? He asked. Yes, is there anything else? The woman was shocked and immediately asked. Hearing this, the Tao ancestor pointed at the others and said, Can't you see the difference between you and the others? They can't suppress their impulses now. If it wasn't for the forceful suppression, they would have rushed out one by one and headed to the place where the thing that is closely related to them was born. As he spoke, the Tao ancestor's breathing slightly calmed down, as if he was already able to slightly suppress the astonishingly strong impulse in his heart at this moment. Hearing these words, the woman's face showed a look of shock. She could feel that although she could also feel that impulse, it was still within her range of tolerance. As long as she spent some effort to suppress it, she would eventually be able to suppress it. But the impulse that the others had at this time was so strong that even their minds couldn't be completely suppressed. How could she not be shocked? After all, she and the other cultivators were from the same sect. Even if they hadn't seen each other for a long time, they still understood a lot. Naturally, she knew how firm the minds of these cultivators were, and how unshakable their hearts were. Now, even they couldn't withstand this impulse. What exactly was that impulse? What kind of existence was that thing that she sensed, or rather, that everyone sensed, that was closely related to them? At this time, a light flashed in her mind, and her expression changed greatly as she asked, Who was that just left? At this time, a light flashed in her mind, and her expression changed greatly as she asked. The newcomer was naturally the cultivators who had just arrived in the recent years, and also the cultivators who didn't have a direct master-disciple relationship with them. At this time, the woman said, It seems that this existence is targeting all the cultivators who came from our hometown. It seems that this is the case. The Tao ancestor had naturally guessed this long ago, but at this time, He didn't show any surprise at all and just sighed. Although it was a good thing to know the target, for the current situation, it was still of no help. After all, although this kind of targeting existed, it was ultimately just there. What exactly was the target, and what was the purpose of attracting them there? They didn't know it all, and they couldn't find a solution. At this time, in a very distant place, some kind of impact was produced out of thin air, and then the entire fifth level of the Down Master's Road began to shake violently. At this time, the crackling sound swept across the entire fifth level of the Down Master's Road, so that all the cultivators in the entire fifth level of the Down Master's Road could clearly hear this sound. Naturally, this included the Tao ancestor and the others in a settlement here at this moment. With this movement, the impulse that arose from the bottom of their hearts had disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. In the face of such a change, the Tao ancestor's expression changed slightly. This period of time seems to be the time when he arrived at that location. As he said so, his expression became extremely ugly. Right at this moment, another earth-shattering tremor was heard. In this shock, there seemed to be an incomparably dazzling light erupting from the depths of the light starry sky, suppressing all the light in the light starry sky, and all the light emitted by all the stars that existed in it. It felt as if it had turned into a supreme sun in the entire fifth level of the Down Master's Road. This kind of light was so dazzling that it was unknown how many cultivators could not help but cover their eyes with their palms at this time. For experts of the five tribulation, almost all light, even the light of heaven and earth, was nothing to them. Even if it exploded in front of them, they would at most use a trace of power to cover their eyes, but absolutely not to the extent of covering their faces. But now, in the face of this kind of light, all the cultivators reacted in this way, which was enough to show how extraordinary and terrifying this light was. At this moment, even if all the cultivators had covered their eyes with their palms, they still felt a stinging pain in their eyes, as if their palms were completely useless. The light forcibly penetrated their palms and further penetrated their eyes, directly exploding them into two bloody holes. In just a moment, the entire fifth level of the Down Master's Road had given birth to countless powerful and matchless blind people. However, no matter how weak the cultivators who could enter the fifth level of the Down Master's Road were, they were still experts of the five tribulation. For experts of the five tribulation, physical injuries were nothing at all. No matter what kind of injuries they suffered, as long as the power that caused them dissipated, they could completely recover. Even the bloody holes caused by this strange light were the same. After the light dissipated, all the cultivators quickly recovered. Their eyes focused again, and they regained their vision. It was also at this time that they saw the changes in the entire fifth level of the Down Master's Road. At this time, in the fifth level of the Down Master's Road, there was an extremely shocking hole. This hole was deep and unfathomable. At first glance, it seemed to lead to the endless abyss of hell, and one could even vaguely see a gray existence wriggling in the depths of the hole. Chapter 2560. At this moment, a soft snort came from somewhere and instantly flashed across the entire fifth level of the Down Master's path, allowing all the cultivators on the fifth level to hear this sound. Most of the cultivators instantly recognized the source of this sound. This is the ruler's voice. Why does the ruler sound so angry? The Tao ancestor showed an inexplicable look of bewilderment on his face. He could not understand what was going on. Could it be that the destruction of this place affected the ruler's forbidden area? A disciple said with some hesitation. At this moment, all of them felt that their minds had returned to normal, and the strong impulse that had suddenly appeared before had completely disappeared. Only after the conversation was over did they realize what had happened. All of their faces were filled with bewilderment and bewilderment. Let's go and take a look, the woman said at this moment. At this moment, she also felt that the change in mentality had disappeared. However, this only made her even more curious, and she wanted to know exactly what was going on. I'll go. You guys stay here. The Tao ancestor sighed and said, although the person who went there was not his disciple, he was still his junior. as an existence that was respected by all the native cultivators on the continent of the Tall Pagoda as the Tao ancestor for billions of years. He felt that he should be responsible for all the cultivators on the continent of the Tall Pagoda. It was also because of this responsibility that he was willing to accept the cultivators of the continent of the Tall Pagoda, who were obviously not his disciples, to settle down and cultivate in this settlement. At this moment, he faintly felt that the huge change that had affected the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path was related to the cultivator who had been attracted by the change in mentality. At this moment, he was not willing to sit back and watch. Hearing this, the other cultivators were stunned for a moment before they all obediently bowed and agreed to his request. Only the woman, who was the disciple of the Tao ancestor, shook her head at this moment and said, "It's better for me to go. Teacher can stay here." After all, even teacher can't break free from the influence of that mentality just now, but I can suppress it. If teacher goes, if things change again, I'm afraid that things will be irreversible. In contrast, I have a greater chance of success if I go. Hearing this, the other cultivators hurriedly nodded. That's right, Junior's sister is right. Teacher should stay here. We need him more here. One by one, the cultivators hurriedly tried to persuade the Tao ancestor to stay in this settlement. This settlement was built by this Tao ancestor. He understood this settlement the best, and he had the highest authority in this place. If he left, the safety of this settlement would obviously be greatly affected. Thus, even if it was just for their own benefit, these cultivators were extremely eager for the Tao ancestor to stay in this settlement. Not to mention that their feelings for the Tao ancestor were extremely sincere, but they could not sit by and watch as the Tao ancestor risked his life. However, the Tao ancestor was able to become the Tao ancestor of the Tall Pagoda continent. He was able to walk at the forefront of countless cultivators and eventually transcend the Tall Pagoda continent to come here and establish this settlement. His determination was self-evident. At this time, even though many disciples were trying to persuade him to stay, he did not waver. He shook his head and said, "I must go. It's my responsibility. At most, I'll let Tian Xing go with me." Tian Xing was obviously that woman. Hearing this, Tian Xing opened her mouth, but in the end, she couldn't persuade her teacher. It was very difficult for others to intervene in matters like responsibility. To be able to cultivate to the level of a fifth tribulation powerhouse, one's will must have reached the point of stubbornness. Once such an existence decided on something, it would be extremely difficult to change it. At this time, since the Tao ancestor had decided that he was responsible for that cultivator, then no matter what Tian Xing said, it would be impossible to change his mind. At this time, the only thing she could do was to cooperate with her teacher and work hard to help him complete this so-called responsibility. Let's go. There seems to be a battle going on there. At this time, the Tao ancestor seemed to have sensed something and showed an anxious expression. When Tian Xing heard this, she didn't dare to tarry. She bid farewell to the others and quickly followed her teacher towards the large hole in the ground. At the same time, there were countless cultivators on the fifth level of the Tao Master's path who were also working hard towards the area that had appeared in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. They wanted to see what was happening there. At this time, all the cultivators had already understood that what had appeared there was not the hole on the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. After all, if it was a real hole, the power of the Tao Master's prison would have already descended and completely captured and suppressed the existence that had caused this hole. However, if it was not a hole, then what was it? This was very surprising. At this time, the cultivators who were constantly moving towards the huge abyss were all bursting with curiosity and wanted to find out what was happening there. Some of these cultivators were relatively close to the abyss, while others were relatively far away. When the so-called Tao ancestor and Tian Xing set off, some cultivators had already arrived at the side of the abyss and saw with their own eyes the vast abyss that felt like a whole new universe. In the abyss, they could feel that it was filled with endless and terrifying power. Vaguely, it seemed that even the state of chaos existed in the deepest part of the abyss, and it was enough to completely mince, devour, and assimilate anything that fell into the abyss. At this time, There were over a dozen figures engaged in an extremely intense battle in the center of the abyss. Among these dozen figures, there were 13 that were constantly attacking the other two figures. Among the other two figures, one of them was in a daze, as if he did not understand what was happening at all. As for the other one, it seemed to be completely made up of countless strange root structures. Although it looked strange, it did not fear the other 13 figures in the battle at all. Even in the battle, it still had the mind to protect the somewhat dazed and dazed figure behind it. The two sides of this battle were naturally the 13 Seventh Tribulation experts and Luo Fan. Fellow Taoist, why are you doing this? We're just borrowing a bit of karma from this person. At this time, among the 13 Seventh Tribulation experts, one of them sighed and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan only sneered and said, Are you guys joking? Are you borrowing his karma? Or are you borrowing my karma? His current body was not his real body, but a strange incarnation that was made up of the roots emitted by the light of heaven and earth. In terms of level, this strange incarnation was naturally only at the level of an existence like Luo Fan, which was also the level of a Sixth Tribulation expert. However, in terms of physical strength and combat power, it was definitely not something that an ordinary Sixth Tribulation expert could compare to. In fact, even a Seventh Tribulation expert would not be much of a threat to this root incarnation as long as they did not attack with their real bodies. At this very moment, in this extremely tragic battle, the incarnation of the roots could split and reunite, suddenly separating and reuniting. As it changed, the roots stirred the endless abyss around it, releasing unimaginable power. While resisting the attacks of the Seven Tribulation cultivators with incomparably subtle and profound trajectories, it was also constantly looking for opportunities to counterattack. The 13 Seven Tribulation cultivators, who clearly had a higher realm, could not suppress Luo Fan at all, nor could they break through Luo Fan's defense to take away the cultivator from the mainland of the spire behind him. Fellow Taoist, why do you say that? The karma I borrowed can only be connected to that place of opportunity at most. How could it be connected to you? Another Seventh Tribulation cultivator said. In a situation where they could not take down Luo Fan, they could only hope to use words to make Luo Fan cooperate with their plan and actions. Luo Fan just sneered and said, You guys are in a difficult situation now, yet you still want to deceive me with empty words? If you want to borrow karma from that land of opportunity, you first need to borrow karma from the mainland of the Tall Tower. Isn't this borrowing karma for me? Could it be that after deducing for so long, in the end, you can only think of this trick? That's not what you said when you made the deal with me. The expressions of the 13 Seventh Tribulation experts did not change in the slightest. They were not moved by what Luo Fan said at all. It felt as if what Luo Fan said had nothing to do with them. As Seven Tribulation experts, their minds were firm. They were stronger than Fifth Tribulation experts, but not weaker. Since they had already made up their minds to attack, they were naturally prepared to suffer all kinds of criticism and provocation. At this time, what Luo Fan said was not unexpected to them at all. It was not enough to move them at all. It could be said that there was only one thing that they had predicted incorrectly. That was Luo Fan's strength. According to their original plan, after they built this abyss, they would immediately transfer all the movements here to the mainland of the Tall Tower with the help of the unique essence of a cultivator who came from the mainland of the Tall Tower. Then, they would transfer to the land of opportunity below the Tall Tower through the mainland of the Tall Tower. In that case, all the movements here would have nothing to do with them. As experts who went against the flow of the 7th floor of the Tao Master's Road, their aura would be completely concealed. Their auras would be completely concealed. At that time, let alone the Tao Master's Purgatory, even the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road would probably ignore them. In this way, the abyss that they had built would be safe, and they would be completely unaffected by the 5th floor of the Tao Master's Road. In their opinion, even if Luo Fan knew what they were thinking, he would eventually have no choice but to accept it. It was impossible for him to have any strength to resist them. After all, this was not the forbidden area that had been refined by Luo Fan. Instead, this was their home ground. Under such circumstances, even if Luo Fan wanted to stop them, he would not be able to pose any threat to them. However, it was a pity that the final development was beyond their imagination. Luo Fan's reaction was so intense. He had actually directly made a move to stop them. More importantly, he was actually able to stop them. Faced with such a situation, the seven tribulation experts were already in a dilemma. Even if they knew that the development of the situation was beyond their control, they could only bite the bullet and continue. At this moment, their foothold in the abyss had already been built. However, the aura that leaked out when they built this abyss had been compressed into the body of the cultivator who was being protected by Luo Fan at this time. They were just waiting for the cultivator to transfer the aura to the continent of the tall tower through the karma connection, and then to the land of the last opportunity. Once they completed this last step, the birth of this abyss would become a derivation of the land of opportunity and a natural product in the eyes of the Tao Master Path. From then on, it would have nothing to do with them, and there would be no repercussions. However, if they were stopped at this step, they wouldn't be able to continue guiding the aura. They wouldn't be able to send the aura into the final land of fortune through the karmic connection, and the aura would eventually burst out of the cultivator's body. At that time, not to mention the Tao Master Path and the Tao Master Prison, even an ordinary creature would be able to clearly know that this abyss was built by them. At that time, the power of the Tao Master Prison would definitely descend, and they would be directly suppressed by the power of the Tao Master Prison. In fact, even their physical bodies would be greatly damaged by this change, and it was even possible that their physical bodies would be completely suppressed. Don't forget, this abyss was so huge that it was even bigger than the forbidden area that Luo Fan had refined. At this time, the aura had not yet leaked out. It gave the Tao Master's Road a feeling that it was a natural forbidden area in another form. Naturally, there would not be too many changes, and there would not be the power of the Tao Master's Prison descending. Chapter 2561. In the face of these seven tribulation experts, the strength that Luo Fan could exert was far more powerful than that of an ordinary fifth tribulation expert. He was even stronger than almost all the six tribulation experts. Under such circumstances, in the face of Luo Fan, these seven tribulation experts seemed to be extremely powerless. They could only watch as time ticked by and watch as their auras could not be suppressed any longer. Seeing that the worst result was about to happen, these seven tribulation experts all looked anxious. At this time, how could they still care about the existence of their relatives and friends in the continent of the tower that Luo Fan now controlled? Originally, the fear of hurting the innocent had been thrown to the back of their minds. For a moment, attacks continuously flew towards Luo Fan. They wanted to subdue Luo Fan, so that Luo Fan could not stop them, so that their auras could smoothly connect with the land of opportunity under the continent of the tower. However, it was a pity that Luo Fan would never agree to their idea and plan. If he really agreed, wouldn't he become the assistant of these seven tribulation experts? When these seven tribulation experts return from the land of opportunity in the future, wouldn't it be inconvenient for him to help share the pressure? In this case, wouldn't the previous deal be just a bubble? In the face of such a situation, one could imagine Luo Fan's reaction. At this time, the root incarnation that he had condensed directly stimulated the power of the light of heaven and earth contained in it to the limit. All kinds of strange means were displayed on it, constantly blocking the attacks outside, so that no matter what the seven tribulation experts did, they could only return in vain. During this process, the abyss seemed to have given birth to countless dimensions out of thin air. Countless attacks constantly surged towards Luo Fan's root incarnation through these dimensions. And Luo Fan's counterattack also penetrated the countless dimensions, colliding with the attacks in those dimensions, causing those dimensions to shatter piece by piece, making the scene in this abyss more and more terrifying and tragic. In this kind of battle, time seemed to have no meaning as it was extremely stretched. It seemed to be just a few breaths from the outside, but in here, millions of years had passed. In this process, the two sides had exchanged hundreds of millions of moves with each other. In this exchange, the faces of many Seventh Tribulation experts became darker and darker. They were shocked to find that Luo Fan's root incarnation in front of them didn't remain the same. Instead, it was constantly improving its own strength and sublimating its own means. Originally, at the very beginning, they were still able to occasionally destroy some of the roots, forcing Luo Fan's main body to turn around and use the light of heaven and earth to replenish these roots. Only then would he be able to maintain the root incarnation's integrity, and only then would he be able to continue fighting and resist them. However, as time passed, after a few breaths had passed outside, and millions of years had passed inside, they found that now, their attacks were actually becoming more and more powerless against Luo Fan's root incarnation. In the face of this root incarnation, they couldn't even shake it. They could only watch as these roots became more and more solid, and the changes of these roots became more and more exquisite. They watched as these roots' use of the dimensions and the power of the light of heaven and earth became more and more exquisite. Under such changes, they had less and less confidence in the final hope of victory. Fellow Taoist, are you trying to kill us all? A Seventh Tribulation expert finally couldn't help but say to Luo Fan, I'm not trying to kill you all. This is the original deal. When you made the deal with me, you agreed that you didn't need my support at all. But now, fellow Taoist wants to drag me onto the boat and force me to share the burden of fellow Taoist's return in the future. How can such a thing be justified? Luo Fan said indifferently, It's just a transit. Why do you care so much? Another Seventh Tribulation expert said. Hearing this, Luo Fan sneered. Just a transit? Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under from his transit? Maybe my life will completely collapse in this transit, and I'll die a violent death. If this kind of thing happened to you, would you do it? Those Seven Tribulation experts naturally couldn't believe Luo Fan, and just said, Fellow Taoist, you're exaggerating. This kind of pressure is nothing to you. At this time, Luo Fan was no longer in the mood to talk nonsense with them. The determination of these cultivators couldn't be shaken by external things. Now, they were sure that their means wouldn't affect Luo Fan at all. They thought that Luo Fan was just being stingy and wanted to force them to their deaths. Under such circumstances, no matter what Luo Fan said, even if he told them about his difficulties, they wouldn't believe him. In this way, it was meaningless for Luo Fan to say anything else. Under such circumstances, why should Luo Fan say anything else? In short, I won't back down. No matter what you say, it's the same. Luo Fan just said lightly. As he spoke, he once again strengthened the protective array around the cultivator behind him, making that cultivator safer. If it weren't for those Seven Tribulation experts being on guard at all times, he might have sped up the flow of time of that cultivator. As long as he sped up the flow of time, he wouldn't be able to suppress the aura that the Seven Tribulation experts poured into his body in the blink of an eye. At that time, the aura would erupt, and the Seven Tribulation experts wouldn't have time to care about him. At that time, the Tao Master's Path and Tao Master's Prison would replace Luo Fan to stop them, or even directly capture them into the Tao Master's Prison and completely suppress them. It was a pity that this was an abyss created by the Seventh Tribulation experts. The structure and laws of this abyss were extremely perfect and stable. Even Luo Fan couldn't shake it. He could only go with the flow. On the other hand, the Seventh Tribulation experts could easily manipulate the laws of the abyss and use them to achieve their goals. For example, they could restrict the flow of time of that cultivator, slowing it down to an unimaginable degree, so that the time that he could restrict the aura would be extremely long. In fact, the flow of time of that cultivator was already the result of Luo Fan's acceleration. However, even after this acceleration, the flow of time was already tens of thousands of times slower than the flow of time in the outside world. In other words, even if thousands of years had passed in the outside world, it would only be a few breaths for that cultivator. In this case, at this moment, in the eyes of that cultivator, the speed of the battle between Luo Fan and the Seven Tribulation experts was probably beyond the scope of his understanding. In his eyes, they had already become invisible. It was just like how an ordinary person couldn't detect how many times a fly had flapped its wings in a short period of time. For this cultivator, in that short period of time, how many moves Luo Fan had exchanged with the seven tribulation experts, and how the battle situation was between them, were all meaningless to him. It was even possible that he couldn't see an illusion. What conditions do you have to give up? A seventh tribulation expert suddenly asked. His words caused the attacks of the seven tribulation experts to suddenly stop. They suddenly realized that it seemed that fighting was not really necessary. When there was a dispute between cultivators and there was a conflict of interest, as long as the conditions were agreed, everything could be discussed. Just like the deal between them and Luo Fan before. Luo Fan clearly didn't seem to have any interest in making a deal with him before, but didn't they rely on some conditions to make Luo Fan agree to make a deal with them? Since it was possible before, it should be possible now too. As long as they paid certain conditions, it should obviously not be a problem. Immediately, the seven tribulation experts said, "That's right. What conditions do you have, fellow Taoist? As long as we can do it, we definitely won't refuse." The feeling of directly extending their necks to be slaughtered by the other party was quite uncomfortable. At this moment, the seven tribulation experts were filled with dissatisfaction and grievance. However, the situation was stronger than they were. Obviously, this was the only thing they could do now. Whatever it was, they could only talk about it after they got through this crisis. Hearing their words, Luo Fan just shook his head indifferently and said, "Fellow Taoists, there's no need to say anything more. Any conditions were out of the question. This time, it's really not a matter of whether I'm willing or not, but whether I can do it. What you're doing is simply sending me into the abyss of death. No matter how good the conditions are, compared to this result, it's insignificant." The seven tribulation experts frowned one by one. They had thought about it countless times and deduced countless times. They had already deduced billions of possible outcomes. In their deductions, none of them could have caused Luo Fan's death, nor could they have caused Luo Fan to suffer much damage. Under such circumstances, how could they believe Luo Fan's conclusion just because of Luo Fan's words? Even if Luo Fan had already helped several fellow Taoists out of the land of opportunity and had gained a lot of experience, it was still the same. At this time, hearing Luo Fan's words, none of them took it to heart. They just quietly looked at Luo Fan, their eyes full of inquiry and disappointment. "Fellow Taoist, you really can't make an exception?" A seven tribulation expert said indifferently. Luo Fan just shook his head and sighed. Sure enough, in the end, it still didn't make sense. These seven tribulation experts were able to walk from the first level to the seventh level of the Tao Master's path. They were also able to go against the flow from the seventh level to the fifth level. They were able to find so many ways to enter the opportunity lands and refine so many magic weapons. Their trust in themselves and their self-awareness was unimaginably strong in the Forbidden Land. No matter what he said, no matter how he presented the facts and reason, they ultimately believed in himself more. Not to mention, at this time, it was unknown whether it was just one of the practitioners or the result of the deduction of more than a dozen practitioners. Under such circumstances, it was needless to say who they would trust. Seeing that Luo Fan couldn't make sense of it, these seven tribulation experts finally lost their patience, and their eyes turned red. "Fellow Taoist, don't forget that we are just aura incarnations here. Our real bodies are countless times more powerful than aura incarnations." A seventh tribulation expert sneered. Hearing this, Luo Fan also smiled faintly. Now that it had actually changed to a threat, there was naturally nothing more to say. "Then I will wait for your real bodies to arrive," Luo Fan just said indifferently. The faces of these seven tribulation experts became extremely cold and hard. One by one, they looked coldly at Luo Fan. At this time, an unimaginable pressure began to radiate from these practitioners, constantly piling up towards Luo Fan, trying to cover Luo Fan in this terrifying aura, so that Luo Fan would be shocked by this aura. Facing this kind of threat, this kind of pressure, Luo Fan's expression didn't change in the slightest. At this time, it could be said that he could advance and retreat at will, so he didn't need to worry about them at all. Not to mention anything else. Even if he couldn't stop these 7 tribulation experts in the end, he only needed to kill the cultivator behind him. Then everything would be over. These cultivators would no longer be a threat to him, nor would they be a threat to the final land of opportunity. Moreover, apart from this, if he could stop them, then these cultivators would become his training targets. This wasn't a bad thing. They had said all they wanted to say, and the contradiction between them could not be resolved with words at all. Naturally, there was nothing left to say, and the only possibility was to fight. At this time, those 7 tribulation experts seemed to have become hysterical, completely disregarding their own endurance. And all kinds of power possessed by 7 tribulation experts erupted without reservation, crazily sending it to Luo Fan. Through the locking of aura, they completely targeted Luo Fan, covering the sky and covering the earth, and illuminating the whole abyss with brilliant light. At first glance, it didn't even look like an abyss, but like the forbidden area controlled by Luo Fan, becoming a more conspicuous existence than the star in the 5th layer of the Town Master's Road. This kind of attack lasted for several breaths. Chapter 2562. At a certain moment, 7 tribulation experts' eyes suddenly lit up, and some kind of power suddenly began to rush in a certain direction. Looking at the direction of the impact, it was surprisingly outside the abyss. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that something was wrong. The perception of his main body surged out and began to lock in the direction of the power, in the direction where the power of the 7 tribulation expert was spreading. After all, Luo Fan's main body was a 6th tribulation expert. Moreover, it was a 6th tribulation expert who had already accurately sensed the arrival of the 7th tribulation. Needless to say, his strength was strong. This kind of strength allowed him to have all kinds of incredible power on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. In particular, after he comprehended some of the essence of the power of the 7 tribulation experts, this kind of power reached a height that ordinary cultivators could not understand. This method of locking in on the landing point of a certain aura on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path was really not difficult for him. In just an instant, with the power of the light of heaven and earth, he directly saw the landing point. The place where they landed was a normal starry sky. There were 2 cultivators, 1 male and 1 female, hurrying over there. Luo Fan was quite familiar with these 2 cultivators. They had both transcended from the continent of the Tall Tower, and were cultivators who had some kinship with Luo Fan. The man was the so-called Tao ancestor, and the woman was the female cultivator who had triggered Luo Fan's inspiration. At this moment, the power released by the 7 tribulation powerhouse had already enveloped them. As this power enveloped them, the 2 cultivators' bodies became sluggish. In the blink of an eye, their movements came to a complete halt. Their bodies seemed to have endured an unbelievable pressure. They froze in the void, or rather, they froze in the endless light. They were unable to move at all. What is this? The woman, who was also Tian Xing, had a look of horror on her face at this moment. She opened her mouth and shouted. The attitude of living beings would change according to the environment. The identity of the person he interacted with was one of the environments. For Tian Xing, under normal circumstances when she was in charge and needed to rely on herself for everything, she would naturally be able to perform perfectly, be self-sufficient, and constantly strive to improve herself. However, the situation was different now that he had his teacher, whom he revered so much, by his side. With her teacher by her side, she had a target to rely on. Her past experiences with her teacher would once again dominate her mind. In this way, it would cause her to show dependence, causing her to be unable to perfectly activate her trait of constantly striving to become stronger. It was precisely because of this that she would ask this question at the first possible moment, and not investigate what exactly it was. At this moment, a stream of aura poured into the bodies of the man and woman, turning them into the carrier of the aura, or rather, the transfer of the aura, with the help of the connection of karma, surged towards the continent of the spire. This was the seventh tribulation powerhouse who had sensed the arrival of the Tao ancestor and Tianxing. Since he couldn't do anything to Luo Fan, he turned to another path and wanted to achieve his goal through the Tao ancestor and Tianxing. In fact, compared to the cultivator behind Luo Fan, Tianxing and the Tao ancestor were more suitable targets. After all, as the Tao ancestor and the youngest disciple of the Tao ancestor, the karmic connection between them and the continent of the spire was obviously much closer than that of the cultivator behind Luo Fan. Since the karmic connection was closer, the bridge of communication built through the karmic connection would naturally be smoother. Of course, it would be less difficult to transfer the aura over, and the speed of transferring the aura would naturally be faster. Seeing this, Luo Fan's expression suddenly darkened. Then, he sensed something, and his expression couldn't help but become rather strange. His expression darkened because the cultivator could actually think of such a way to break through. In this case, it would be many times more difficult to stop him than before. After all, the number of cultivators who had transcended from the continent of the spire was already quite large. Even if Luo Fan protected the Tao ancestor and Tianxing, they could still find other cultivators. Even if those cultivators resided in a rather secretive place, it was still in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. For the seven tribulation powerhouses, it was not a difficult place to find. Thinking of this, it would be strange if Luo Fan's expression did not darken. What made his expression turn strange was that he suddenly discovered a rather strange fact. The fact was that the aura that the seven tribulation powerhouse poured into the bodies of the Tao Master and Tianxing contained only his own aura. As for the aura of the other cultivators, he completely ignored them. This situation was completely different from the way they fought against Luo Fan in the abyss at this time. How could Luo Fan not feel strange about this contradiction? Is this an internal strife? This thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind, causing his expression to become increasingly strange. He thought about it a little and vaguely understood the cultivator's thoughts. Obviously, he wanted to give Luo Fan a choice. He placed himself and the other seven tribulation powerhouses on opposite sides of the scale so that Luo Fan could decide which side to stop. Was it his own aura or the aura of the other cultivators? According to what he thought, Luo Fan should have made stopping the seven tribulation powerhouses as his goal and regarded his own aura as the secondary target. In this case, there was a greater chance that he could successfully sneak his aura into the final place of opportunity. He had clearly found a small chance of success in this impossible situation. If Luo Fan wasn't too strong and couldn't use the same strength to target two different positions, this result might really have happened. However, it was clear that Luo Fan's strength wasn't as weak as the seven tribulation powerhouse imagined. Not to mention anything else, the one fighting against the seven tribulation powerhouses was merely a root avatar that he had condensed with the help of some of the light of heaven and earth. Such an existence was already strong enough to fight against the seven tribulation powerhouses. Not to mention that his real body hadn't been touched, and he could condense multiple root avatars at will. In this way, he could naturally split them up and target different targets at will, and he didn't have to worry about the imbalance in the strength of each target. At this moment, with just a thought, the roots of the light of heaven and earth began to rapidly spread towards the Tao ancestor and Tianxing. In the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into a root avatar. Just like the root avatar in the abyss, after the root avatar was condensed, it unhesitatingly attacked the power that had enveloped the Tao ancestor and Tianxing. This time, it didn't target anything else, but the aura of the seven tribulation powerhouse that was enveloped by the power. The seven tribulation powerhouse usually concealed his aura to the extreme. Even if he was here, it would be difficult to discover his existence with just a glance and a sweep of perception. If he used such a method, as long as he didn't go too far, his aura wouldn't leak out and be detected by the fifth level of the Tao Sovereign's path. Therefore, generally speaking, regardless of whether it was the power of a seven tribulation expert or the incarnation of his aura, it would be quite difficult to directly draw out his aura to be discovered by the Tao Master Path and draw out the power of the Tao Master Prison. At the very least, Even Luo Fan would need to carry out some planning to achieve this goal. The power released by the Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse was also similar. Although his power had already charged out of the abyss and erupted towards the Tao Ancestor and Tianxing in the normal starry sky of the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's Path. But if it wasn't for Luo Fan, it wouldn't have leaked much of its aura, nor would the Tao Sovereign's Path discover that the power came from a 7 Tribulation Powerhouse that shouldn't have appeared in the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's Path. However, this was only the might of the power itself. However, that did not mean that the aura that was pouring into the Tao Ancestor and Tianxing's bodies had the same effect. In fact, in order for the aura to be able to connect itself to the final land of opportunity, the aura contained an unimaginably strong essence of a 7th Tribulation Powerhouse. In other words, compared to the avatar of a 7th Tribulation Powerhouse, this aura was even more representative of a 7th Tribulation Powerhouse. In this way, if this aura were to explode and be discovered by the Tao Master's Path, then the power of the Tao Master's Purgatory would definitely descend. Moreover, the speed at which it descended might not be much slower than when it descended with its real body. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's intention for targeting this aura was very obvious. The power also instantly discovered the arrival of Luo Fan's root avatar. At the same time, it also discovered the intention of the root avatar. It couldn't help but be shocked. "Fellow Taoist, why must you be so ruthless?" A voice suddenly rang out from within the power. There was a strong sense of horror in it, and there was even a hint of pleading in it. One must know that if this aura were to explode and appear on the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path, the cultivator would be completely suppressed by the Tao Master's prison. Hearing this, Luo Fan just faintly said, "Exterminate them? I've already said so much. Do you already think that I'm targeting you?" As he spoke, he did not stop moving at all. He released his roots and instantly enveloped the space-time within a range of unknown number of light years, making it seem as if he had complete control over the space-time here. Nothing was out of his control at this moment. This had almost created a home field. Only someone like Luo Fan, who was in the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's Path, and whose light of heaven and earth was so powerful, could create such a home field at this time. After all, this required an extremely deep understanding of the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's Path, and an unimaginable ability to control everything here. Moreover, one had to resist the backlash of the Tao Sovereign's Path. If one's body was not here, and if one did not have a deep understanding of the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's Path, it would be difficult to resist the backlash of the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's Path. Such a home field would not be able to last for long, and it might not even be able to take shape. This point could be seen from the fact that the 7 Tribulation Powerhouses had to pay such a huge price to build that abyss as their foothold after returning from the land of opportunity. Even now, Luo Fan still had his throat in his grasp. This showed how difficult it was. After all, the home field that Luo Fan had created was not much different from the abyss that the 7 Tribulation experts had created. At this moment, the power, or rather, the 7th Tribulation expert felt that his connection with the aura had been weakened to a certain extent. His original plan to take advantage of the opportunity to forcibly send the aura into the continent of the tower, and then into the depths of the land of opportunities, was even more impossible. Without the close connection, it would be impossible to perform such a subtle operation. At this moment, the cultivator was truly terrified. At this point, Luo Fan only needed a thought to completely release the aura and directly let the Tao Sovereign's prison deal with him. "What do you want? Anything can be negotiated." At this moment, he could only shout like this, hoping that Luo Fan had something that could make him pay a certain price to protect his aura, his safety, and his body. At this time, Luo Fan just smiled faintly, quietly watching the power. He did not immediately make a move to detonate the cultivator's aura. After all, at this time, the battle in the abyss was still going on. The battle did not stop. Even if he detonated the cultivator's aura here, the threat of the 7 Tribulation experts still existed and would not disappear. On the contrary, If he detonated the aura here, although there would be one less 7 Tribulation expert as an enemy, the other 7 Tribulation experts would probably go crazy. Chapter 2563. Luo Fan ignored the words of the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse. At this time, he only imprisoned the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse. He didn't completely detonate his aura, nor did he let him go. Detonating the aura would be a temporary pleasure, but it wouldn't be of much help to the final victory. If he let it go, it would make Luo Fan's previous efforts useless. If he wanted to let it go, why did he send the root incarnation here to fight against it? In fact, for Luo Fan, he had already achieved his goal by restraining him here. It should be known that this was his home ground, just like the abyss to those 7 Tribulation Powerhouses. Here, Luo Fan could control everything at will. He could even restrict the connection between the 7 Tribulation Powerhouses' power and his body. Of course, it was only a restriction. It was impossible to completely cut it off. Under this restriction, the 7 Tribulation Powerhouses' aura incarnation could feel that the power still existed. It could also feel that the power was fighting with some kind of existence at this time. But the aura incarnation couldn't know the specifics. Under such circumstances, the longer Luo Fan dragged the battle here, the more unstable the aura and thoughts of the 7 Tribulation Powerhouses' aura incarnation would be. Naturally, he couldn't do his best in the battle in the abyss, and his inability to do his best would obviously have a huge impact on the siege of many 7 Tribulation Powerhouses. It was enough to make their original tacit cooperation no longer perfect and no longer have a tacit understanding. In this case, it would naturally be of great help to the battle in the abyss. Moreover, apart from this, there might be other 7 Tribulation Powerhouses who would discover this 7 Tribulation Powerhouse's method and imitate it. They would also divide their strength to find another way out. In that case, their combined strength would naturally become weaker and weaker. In the end, it would reach an irreversible point, allowing Luo Fan to completely suppress them easily. What's going on? The heart of the 7th Tribulation expert, whose power was restricted by Luo Fan in that space-time, was in a mess. At this time, while he was attacking Luo Fan's root incarnation with the other 7 Tribulation Powerhouses, he was carefully thinking about what happened to the power. Normally, at this time, the power would either be destroyed, or it would have successfully accomplished its goal. How could there be no change until now? In this kind of confusion, his offensive became a little sluggish. Just as Luo Fan thought, his cooperation with the other 7 Tribulation experts was no longer perfect and tight. No one was a fool. The other 7 Tribulation experts weren't either. Very soon, another 7 Tribulation Powerhouse noticed that something was wrong with the situation. He sensed that something was wrong with his companion. After discovering this, the 7th Tribulation expert's imagination began to run wild. He began to carefully think about what caused this situation. With his imagination running wild, he soon discovered a possibility. In an instant, he sent his perception out through the abyss and carefully sensed the entire 5th layer of the Tao Master's path, trying to sense the existence of any abnormalities. In the end, with Luo Fan's intentional connivance, he soon sensed the battlefield constructed by Luo Fan's root incarnation at this moment. At the same time, he also discovered the existence of the power that he was very familiar with in that battlefield. Another way out? The 7th Tribulation Powerhouse instantly understood his companion's thoughts. His heart trembled and a strong light flashed in his eyes. He didn't say anything, nor did he directly accuse his companion of being half-hearted. At this time when they needed to work together, he actually divided his strength to do other things. After all, although these 7 Tribulation experts had been companions for these years, they had only gathered together because of Luo Fan's Spire Continent. They might have known each other before, or maybe they knew each other, but they were mostly strangers to each other. Under such circumstances, the friendship that they had built up in this short period of time was the vast majority of the friendship between them. And it had to be known that any one of these 7 Tribulation Powerhouses could take out a 7 Tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure to trade with Luo Fan for the method to safely leave this land of lucky chances. It was easy to imagine how long each of them would have to cultivate for. In such a long period of time, the friendship that they had built up in this short period of time was just like two strangers passing by. For them, the length of time they had spent building a friendship was equivalent to the time two strangers passed by each other. It could be imagined how much weight such a friendship could carry. At this moment, they seemed to be working together and extremely united. It seemed that each of them had entrusted their backs to each other, but that was only because they had to do so. Under such circumstances, they obviously wouldn't think that it was a crime for others to have their own ideas and plans in the process of cooperation. It was the same even if they were the ones who were affected. In such a situation, the cultivator naturally had no right to accuse his companions of being half-hearted. On the contrary, because of the actions of the cultivator in front of him, he was reminded that he had another way of doing things. He understood that he didn't have to be tied up in this abyss, but to the cultivator who was being protected by Luo Fan. At this moment, a portion of his power also flowed out of the abyss, following the direction of the power that Luo Fan had intercepted and heading towards the settlement of the cultivators who had transcended from the Spire continent. Obviously, he didn't have the intention to compete with his companions for the cultivator in front of him. Instead, he targeted the many cultivators in the settlement. The power unleashed by this kind of seven tribulation expert was clearly mysterious and wonderful. Even if it was just a portion of the power, it already had an incredible effect. The distance barrier of the fifth level of the Tao Master's Path was almost like an existence that could switch between reality and illusion at any time for this power. With just a slight change of the power, it was easily bypassed. In the blink of an eye, the power had already penetrated the barrier of infinite light and arrived at the space-time that Luo Fan had constructed. It was about to penetrate this space-time and reach the settlement of the cultivators. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to have sensed something. The eyes of the root incarnation in the abyss flashed, and it looked at the seventh tribulation expert. At this moment, the expression of the seventh tribulation expert didn't change in the slightest, and his movements didn't change in the slightest because of the power he had just released. If he hadn't clearly sensed the existence of the power and the close connection between the power and the seventh tribulation expert, he might not have believed that the power came from the seventh tribulation expert in front of him. At this moment, the space-time trembled slightly, and a suction force was generated, directly sucking in the power. Before the power could react, it had already been sucked into the space-time and thrown into the battlefield. If the power was still fighting with Luo Fan in the battlefield, the addition of a new power would definitely greatly reduce the pressure on it. It was naturally impossible to reverse the situation of the battle, but it would definitely be enough to make Luo Fan feel troubled. At this moment, the seventh tribulation expert felt the awkwardness of his companions. His perception of his own power had already been greatly weakened. At this moment, he could feel that his power was fighting with some kind of existence, but he couldn't feel who the opponent was at all, let alone the specific situation of the battle. Under such circumstances, he fell into an inexplicable, awkward situation like his companions before him. He didn't know what was going on. Another one. It's a pity that this one is more cautious and didn't inject its aura into it immediately. At this moment, in the space-time, Luo Fan's other root incarnation sighed. At this moment, the new power stimulated a super strong power and used all kinds of extremely subtle methods to fight with him. However, perhaps because of the existence of the seventh tribulation expert's aura, the power didn't immediately grab the Tao ancestor or Tian Xing and inject its own aura into it. Instead, after noticing the existence of Luo Fan's root incarnation, it directly fought with Luo Fan. This situation made it impossible for Luo Fan to directly grab the opponent's throat like he did with the seven tribulation expert's power, which could determine its fate at will. However, he could only obediently fight against this power, subdue it, and restrict it. However, even though it was a pity, it didn't affect his goal much in the end. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan's focus was on restricting the power and cutting off the connection between the power and the main body. As long as the connection between the two was restricted, the seventh tribulation expert would be tied up, and Luo Fan would be able to gain a greater and greater advantage in the abyss. For cultivators at their level, their perception of time was already completely different from that of ordinary living beings. Even if it was a short period of time between breaths, they could treat it as billions of years or even billions of years. Therefore, even if only a few breaths had passed in the outside world, it was equivalent to tens of thousands of years in these two space-times. In the abyss, it was because the seventh tribulation expert had deliberately adjusted it. It was because of their will that in this abyss, except for the cultivator who was protected by Luo Fan, the flow of time in other areas was billions of times faster than the outside world. However, in Luo Fan's home field, that power was able to accelerate its own time and movements, causing Luo Fan's root incarnation to have no choice but to accelerate its own time and movements to stop them. The two seemed to behave similarly, and the time spent in them was many times faster than the outside world, but the principle was fundamentally different. At this time, in the settlement of the cultivators who had transcended from the continent of the tower, the cultivators had not even decided whether to return to their cave mansions or wait here for the Tao ancestor to return. As for the many other cultivators in the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path, they had not yet adapted to the drastic changes in the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path, nor had they adapted to the appearance of the abyss. Even the light that erupted from the birth of the abyss remained in their pupils, and had not completely dissipated. From this, it could be seen how short time had passed in the outside world. In the forbidden area, at this time, in front of the continent of the tower, Luo Fan's figure appeared out of thin air. At this moment, he quietly looked at the continent of the tower, ready to cut off the aura that was transmitted to the continent through the karma connection. Although he was confident that he could cut off all the methods of those seven tribulation experts, he didn't really think that there wouldn't be any accidents. He didn't really think that all his methods would be perfect and that all the interceptions would be successful. His real body appearing here was the last insurance. The last layer of insurance against all possible accidents that might occur. With the existence of this real body, even if there was a problem with the steps of his root incarnation, allowing the aura of the seven tribulation experts to be transmitted to the continent of the tower through some means, he could take advantage of the opportunity to cut off the aura, making the continent of the tower safe again, and completely ruin the plans of the seven tribulation experts. After all, the continent of the tower was completely created by Luo Fan, and all the laws of the tower were formed through him. To him, the control of such a spire continent was naturally quite astonishing. Even if the aura was transmitted through the illusory karma connection, for him, it was just a kind of substantial existence that could be manipulated and cut off at will. At this moment, behind Luo Fan's real body, the light of heaven and earth seemed to be hanging there quietly. At a glance, it seemed to be extremely quiet, without the slightest change appearing on it. However, if one slightly changed the perspective and began to accelerate the flow of time in the perspective, one would see that the light of heaven and earth was not quiet at all. It was clearly violent to the extreme. It could be said that every spot of the light of heaven and earth was evolving and changing crazily at every moment. It was just that the speed of evolution and change was just too fast, exceeding the limits of observation and perception of living beings. That was why it seemed so calm, as if nothing had happened at all. Chapter 2564. It was precisely because the light of heaven and earth needed to support the two root avatars and replenish the consumption of the root avatars that the light of heaven and earth underwent such rapid changes. Novel? Must. Don't forget that the flow of time in the two root avatars had reached the point of billions of times or even trillions of times faster than the outside world. It could be said that every moment in the outside world was equivalent to tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of millions of years for the two root avatars, and during this process, for who knows how many hundreds of millions of years, the root incarnation was engaged in an extremely tragic battle at every moment. In other words, at every moment, the two root clones were constantly losing power and their own power. And this obviously required the support of the light of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, it was imaginable how many changes the light of heaven and earth needed to occur at every moment. It was precisely because of this that the light of heaven and earth had such rapid changes. Fortunately, the light of heaven and earth had already devoured the perfect replicated world that was calculated in billions of trillions. Its level had already reached a height that an ordinary fifth tribulation powerhouse, sixth tribulation powerhouse, and even seventh tribulation powerhouse would not dare to imagine. This allowed the light of heaven and earth to easily withstand this level of consumption at this time. Even the current consumption was not the limit of the light of heaven and earth, but only a small part of it. In other words, even if it was supporting the two root avatars at the same time, the light of heaven and earth was still able to do it easily. If Luo Fan was willing, it would be extremely easy for him to even create more root avatars. The seven tribulation powerhouses naturally did not know about this. Even the two seven tribulation powerhouses who were fighting against Luo Fan's root avatars at the same time could only see some clues at this time. As for the other seven tribulation powerhouses, they could not imagine that Luo Fan could do this at all. For them, it was already incredible that Luo Fan could maintain the root avatars in the abyss at this time to fight them. To be able to send support to the root incarnation without any delay was enough to shock them. But he had never imagined that Luo Fan could actually support another root incarnation and could also open up a battlefield with a seven tribulation expert in another location. Because of this, they never thought that Luo Fan would be able to stop them in other areas. It was precisely because of this thought that the two seventh tribulation transcendents had taken such brazen actions. After all, if they thought that Luo Fan could separate his roots to intercept their powers, no matter how bold they would never send out their powers so casually. One had to know that even though the power was powerful, it was still only a portion of the power that was condensed from the aura. Compared to this aura incarnation, it was countless times weaker, let alone compared to his main body. With such a degree of weakness, if they really faced an existence that could fight against a seventh tribulation powerhouse, it could almost be said that they were handing over their weaknesses to the other party. It was precisely because they instinctively believed that Luo Fan's ability to block them in this abyss was already his limit that they chose to divide their power one after another. With two seventh tribulation powerhouses dividing their powers, this naturally doubled the probability of being discovered. Previously, it was just one seventh tribulation powerhouse sending out his power, but the abnormality caused by this had more than doubled at this time. In this way, some cultivators who did not notice the abnormality when a seventh tribulation powerhouse sent out his power quickly discovered the abnormality. And when they discovered the abnormality, these seventh tribulation powerhouses instantly figured out what was going on. One by one, without making a sound, they actually also sent out their powers, ready to follow in their footsteps and find another way out. In this way, in the other battlefield, the amount of power that Luo Fan's root incarnation grabbed over had unknowingly increased. In the time of a few breaths in the outside world, which was also inside these two battlefields, it was unknown how many billions of years had passed for both sides of the battle. The 13 seven tribulation powerhouses had unknowingly sent their powers to the other battlefield, directly increasing the number of powers in the main field constructed by the falling hair to as many as 13. These powers gathered here, and they all looked at each other, feeling a little awkward. However, because the connection between these powers and their main bodies had been extremely weakened, their main bodies could only sense that they still existed and were still fighting, but they could not feel what they specifically sensed or what the specific battle was going on. This caused their main bodies to still not know that these powers had already gathered again. Their main bodies still acted as if nothing had happened, carrying out a boring alliance and fighting a boring battle with Luo Fan's root incarnation. In a situation where every opponent already had their own thoughts and was already looking for their own way out, It was easy to imagine how strong the combat ability of the 13-7 Tribulation powerhouses could be when they joined forces. At this time, the pressure they caused to Luo Fan was already hundreds or thousands of times weaker than it was at the beginning. Back then, Luo Fan still needed to constantly use the light of the world to support the root incarnation, so that the power in the root incarnation would constantly be replaced. But now, in the hundreds of thousands of years in the abyss, the power in the root incarnation had not been replaced at all. In other words, the root incarnation's current power was completely the same as the root incarnation's power from hundreds of thousands of years ago in the abyss. In the past hundreds of thousands of years, the 13-7 Tribulation powerhouses actually did not consume any of its power at all, nor did they cause any damage to the root incarnation at all. This situation was enough to show how ridiculous the 13-7 Tribulation powerhouses' cooperation was at this time. However, in the face of such a situation, although the 13-7 Tribulation powerhouses were all well aware of it, they had no intention of changing it at all. Each and every one of them set their goal on the power in the distance. Although the power in that place was much weaker than the aura incarnation here, the enemy was also much weaker. In contrast, there was more hope of success there than here. At least, this was the case in the hearts of the 7 Tribulation powerhouses. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly smiled faintly and stopped attacking them. Without the pressure from Luo Fan, the 7 Tribulation powerhouses suddenly stopped one by one. The pressure and attacks that they exerted on the cultivator guarding behind Luo Fan had completely disappeared. The whole process was as if an invisible hand had suddenly pressed the time pause button. This sudden change instantly disrupted the tacit understanding that existed in the hearts of the 13-7 Tribulation powerhouses. Each and every one of them could no longer perform, and could only honestly face everything that Luo Fan had revealed when he lifted the table. What do you all think now? At this time, Luo Fan just looked at the 13 of them indifferently, with a faint smile on his face. The expressions of the 13-7 Tribulation powerhouses were quite ugly. The truth that they had concealed was actually exposed by their opponent at this time. Their unhappiness with each other was secondary. More importantly, a sense of humiliation arose from the bottom of their hearts, as if their faces had been trampled on. They had a tacit understanding with each other and deliberately maintained this kind of scene that nothing had happened and nothing had changed. They wanted to maintain a general balance. So, as if nothing had happened, they still acted as if they were cooperating to besiege Luo Fan. However, at this time, under Luo Fan's means, the truth that they had originally hidden finally was irretrievably revealed, making it impossible for them to continue acting and maintain the balance. How could this not make their expressions change greatly? How could they not feel that they had been offended? However, since it had already been revealed, they naturally threw caution to the wind. At this time, they completely ignored Luo Fan's question and just asked, "What do you plan to do now, fellow Taoist?" Since all of this had been seen by Luo Fan, everything was already under his control. Then, the development of the matter on the other battlefield was naturally not as smooth as they thought. Since it was not going so smoothly, at this time, they simply asked Luo Fan's intentions and asked him how he planned to treat them. At that moment, the expressions of all the 7 Tribulation experts did not change at all. Every single one of them maintained an extremely indifferent expression, as if they had no feelings at all. They did not have any emotional fluctuations at all. Obviously, even at this point, they were still unwilling to let Luo Fan see the panic in their hearts. Perhaps they intended to use this indifferent attitude to make Luo Fan unable to measure how great of a threat Luo Fan could bring to them if he threw caution to the wind. What do you plan to do? Of course, it is to make your plan fail, so that all your changes cannot affect me, Luo Fan said indifferently. His eyes were full of determination, expressing an unshakable will. At this moment, these 7 Tribulation powerhouses felt some kind of invisible spiritual pressure rushing towards them, and their bodies trembled subtly from head to toe. After all, it's just an aura incarnation, but it was actually intimidated by a sixth tribulation powerhouse. That's right, in the hearts of these seven tribulation powerhouses, they had already admitted that Luo Fan was a sixth tribulation powerhouse, an existence that was only one level weaker than them. A level. After all, the battle between them and Luo Fan had lasted in this abyss for billions of years. Even if it was just a root incarnation, it was enough for them to understand a little bit about the nature of Luo Fan's cultivation and accurately measure his true realm. Then, fellow Taoist, can you make an exception and let us take our friends and family away? The seven tribulation powerhouses said at this moment, each of their eyes showing a subtle fluctuation, as if they were pleading, oppressing, and more like a kind of determination. It was obvious that if Luo Fan didn't agree to their request, they would probably go all out and do something that Luo Fan didn't want to see. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan just sneered and said, "Fellow Taoists, are you joking? How can you guarantee what will happen during this period of hundreds of thousands of years? How can I guard against it? You should know that I was just letting you guys go for a few hundred years. You guys have already given me such a big surprise, and I almost became your scapegoat. If these cultivators were given enough time to pick up their relatives and friends, it was naturally not impossible. As long as Luo Fan cooperated with these cultivators, he could slow down the flow of time here, so that hundreds of thousands of years in the outside world would only be a very short period of time here. At that time, hundreds of thousands of years would have passed in the outside world. Their friends and family who were qualified should be able to transcend from the continent of the tower, become fifth tribulation experts, and obtain the right to freely travel and cultivate in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. In that case, they would naturally be able to take their friends and family to any area they wanted to go to, but obviously, this was hundreds of thousands of years. Even if Luo Fan cooperated with them to adjust the flow of time here to a billionth of the outside world, so that a few breaths passed here and hundreds of thousands of years passed in the outside world, it was only for the incarnations of the aura of the seven tribulation experts. The real bodies of the seven tribulation experts were still not affected. In other words, their real bodies had hundreds of thousands of years to plan anything to break Luo Fan's current great advantage, and to make all of Luo Fan's plans completely fail. Although these days Luo Fan had almost completely played these seventh tribulation experts in the palm of his hand, it did not mean that Luo Fan had enough confidence to restrict the real bodies of the seven tribulation experts, and had enough confidence to stop any plans that the real bodies of the seven tribulation experts made. In these hundreds of thousands of years, the real bodies of the seven tribulation experts had too many opportunities to break his current advantage, to make their plans completely successful, and to use Luo Fan as a substitute to bear the pressure of returning from the land of opportunity for them. Thinking of this, how big of a heart did Luo Fan have to be to agree to them? Chapter 2565. Fellow Taoist, aren't you going to do me a favor? A seventh tribulation expert said. Hearing this, Luo Fan just sneered and said, "How is this a favor? It's a matter of my life." For him, if he really let the real bodies of these seventh tribulation experts plot against him for hundreds of thousands of years, the only thing waiting for him was to escape from the Tao Master Path and enter a place of opportunity. Obviously, for him, he had not fully absorbed the benefits of the Tao Master's path, nor had he fully assimilated them into his own. Under such circumstances, how could he be willing to leave the Tao Master Path, let alone be chased out of the Tao Master Path? Seeing Luo Fan like this, those seven tribulation experts knew that no matter what, the best result would not happen. However, even if they knew this, they did not feel too disappointed because of it. No one in the world was a fool, especially those who could cultivate to this level. They were all intelligent. How could Luo Fan not see through such a big flaw in his plan? Since they knew that Luo Fan could see through it, they naturally did not have the slightest hope that this plan would succeed. At this moment, a strange look appeared on the faces of these seven tribulation experts. In the end, they all fixed their eyes on the seven tribulation expert who first sent out his power to find a way out. Shockingly, They had suddenly sensed the bit of power that they had sent out in search of a way out. They clearly knew what that bit of power had experienced over the past few days and the specific state of that power at this moment. Knowing this, they naturally knew the awkward situation of the seventh tribulation expert who was looking for a way out at the very beginning. The seventh tribulation expert's expression suddenly changed at this moment. However, he had also sensed the awkward situation he was in, and his expression became extremely ugly. If I had known this would happen, I wouldn't have been so anxious. At this moment, such a thought flashed in his mind. Previously, he thought that he wasn't much different from other cultivators. Although his power was hindered outside, and he couldn't achieve his goal, he couldn't find another way out for himself. However, he wasn't much weaker than other seventh tribulation cultivators. However, at this moment, when his aura incarnation truly connected with that power, he realized that it wasn't that there wasn't much of a difference, but that the difference was simply too great. Previously, when he had sent out his power, not only did it not give him another way out, but it had also put another noose around his neck. He was waiting for the noose to tighten and completely destroy him. "Fellow Taoist, what do you want?" The seventh tribulation expert shouted with an ugly expression. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "I'm just inviting everyone to head to that place of opportunity." Hearing this, the expressions of the seventh tribulation experts changed drastically. It was obvious that he wanted to drive all of them out of the path of Down Master. At that moment, intense anger surged in the hearts of the seventh tribulation powerhouses, causing their expressions to become extremely ugly. Some of them even began to tremble slightly from anger. After all, the cultivation in the path of Down Master was very important to them, and it could even guide them forward. This was enough to make them extremely reluctant to leave the path of Down Master. More importantly, their relatives and friends were still in the continent of the tower, still waiting for them to receive them, waiting for them to transcend and enter the fifth level of the path of Down Master. If they left at this time and were forced into that place of opportunity, wouldn't they be completely abandoned? For these seven tribulation experts who were willing to spend a lot of time and money to trade with Luo Fan, this was obviously unacceptable. However, they wanted to refute Luo Fan, but found that they had no confidence to do so, because the biggest advantage now was in the hands of Luo Fan. As long as Luo Fan was willing, these seven tribulation experts could directly attract the power of the Down Master's prison to descend, directly capture and suppress them, and maybe even for eternity. As for resistance, although they were seven tribulation experts, this kind of power was completely insufficient in the face of the Down Master's prison. If the Down Master's prison really came for them, their only outcome would be to follow the power of the Down Master's prison into the Down Master's prison and be completely suppressed. Obviously, such an outcome was also unacceptable to them. Looking at the faces of these cultivators, Luo Fan knew what they were thinking. At this time, he just smiled and said, "Fellow Taoists, rest assured, when your relatives and friends come out, I will naturally send them to reunite with you." Hearing this, at this moment, the seven tribulation experts revealed an indescribable expression. They seemed to be a little angry, a little tempted, and a little grateful. Naturally, they were angry because although the place of opportunity was not small and was enough for a cultivator to obtain a considerable amount of benefits from it, the degree of danger was no less than that of the opportunity. Even if it was them, they would have to tremble with fear and cautiously deal with all the possible dangers that might appear. Even if their relatives and friends transcended the continent of the High Pagoda, they would only be the weakest fifth tribulation experts, entering the place of opportunity with such strength. Although it was not to say that they would be sending themselves to the door, they would definitely not be able to obtain any benefits. It would be fine if they were by their side, but if they were sent to an unknown place, then before they could find them, they would probably not even know how they died. Thinking of this, how could they not be angry? However, although they were angry, they also had to admit that Luo Fan's proposal was actually giving them a lot of face. After all, in this situation where they were meat on the chopping block, Luo Fan was still willing to discuss with them, and was still willing to try to give them a solution that satisfied both sides. To a certain extent, This was already worthy of their gratitude. Fellow Taoist, can you let us think about it? A seventh tribulation expert said. Of course, no problem. I only hope that you can think about it carefully before I completely subdue your power. Otherwise, don't blame me. Luo Fan said. At this time, in another place on the 5th floor of the Road of Tao Master, in the battlefield space-time that Luo Fan had created, Luo Fan's root incarnation began to intensify the attack on the various powers. As he intensified the attack, a terrifying aura rose from his body, directly shaking the entire space-time, and even faintly shaking the endless brilliance that existed outside the space-time. At this moment, the entire 5th floor of the Road of Tao Master seemed to have an extra sun out of thin air, which looked several times brighter and more dazzling than the countless other stars. In the face of such a change, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and there was a faint smile on his face. On the surface, he did not seem to be urging them, but in fact, this kind of action was already the greatest urging to them. After all, if those powers were completely erased, it would not be much of a loss for other 7th Tribulation experts. However, for the 7th Tribulation expert who was the first to find a way out, the situation was obviously different. Once that power was erased, then his aura would be completely under Luo Fan's control. At that time, no matter what Luo Fan wanted to do, whether he wanted to send the 7th Tribulation expert's real body into the Tao Master's prison, let him go, or directly expel him from the 5th floor of the Road of Tao Master, it would all depend on his mood at that time. Obviously, this kind of result of completely entrusting his fate and his life to the other party's mood was absolutely not the result that he wanted to see. And once this result occurred, who would this cultivator hate the most? Of course, he would hate Luo Fan, but what about the other 7th Tribulation experts? Would he be grateful to the other 7 Tribulation experts for helping his aura incarnation to fight the enemy at this time? It could be imagined that once this result occurred, the cultivator would definitely hate the other companions in this abyss at this moment. Even if they did not have much friendship, during the process, they would have their own ideas, and they would not let each other go. But after all, they were also companions, and they had said before that they would help each other. Now that he was being threatened, his aura was completely controlled by others, and his fate was completely changed by others' mood. The other cultivators actually did not work hard to help, but instead watched helplessly, wanting to see what the other party was going to do. How could he accept this? How could he not hate the other cultivators? Since Luo Fan could think of this, naturally the other cultivators could also think of this. At this moment, everyone had already understood that they had to make a decision before their power was completely defeated. Otherwise, they would have one more enemy, an enemy at the level of a 7th Tribulation expert. Luo Fan stood there quietly, with an inexplicable expression on his face. He looked at these cultivators with a faint smile on his face, watching their expressions gradually change, and watching their eyes finally make up their minds. In the end, in just a few minutes, a cultivator made a decision. He said to Luo Fan, "I agree. As long as you are willing to send my son to the place of opportunity, when he comes out, I will leave immediately." Luo Fan slightly smiled, nodded, and said, "Fellow Taoist, don't worry. I will try my best to locate fellow Taoist and send your son to fellow Taoist." These words were completely from the bottom of his heart, and there was not the slightest hint of insincerity in them. Anyone who heard these words would be able to clearly sense his determination to do as he said. In an instant, the other cultivators had a lot more confidence in Luo Fan. However, he had already believed that Luo Fan would definitely do as he said. At this moment, the first cultivator who looked for a way out directly came before Luo Fan, bowed, and said, "I am also willing to leave and will not return in the future. I only hope that you will not forget to send my daughter here." Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "This is naturally not a problem. Anyway, it is a piece of cake for me." As he finished speaking, the other cultivators also came forward one after another to communicate with Luo Fan, and one by one, they agreed to the only choice given by Luo Fan, seeing that the last 7th Tribulation expert had completely agreed to it. Luo Fan smiled faintly. At this moment, somewhere outside the abyss, in the space-time established by Luo Fan's root incarnation instantly increased its power. In the blink of an eye, it had already erased the power one by one, causing the power to completely explode at this moment, causing the battlefield to begin to shake in the explosion. In just a few short breaths, there were no other living beings here except for Luo Fan, the Tao Ancestor, and the Heavenly Apricot. The aura of the Seventh Tribulation Expert was also lying quietly in Luo Fan's hand, constantly trembling, flowing, and changing like a living thing. Seeing this change, the expressions of the many Seventh Tribulation Experts slightly stiffened. They originally thought that their power would be able to fight equally with Luo Fan's Root Husser, or at least not perform too badly. But they did not expect that in the end, when the other party fully exerted his power, their power would not be able to resist at all, and had already been completely destroyed by the other party's root incarnation. In this situation, it was obvious that they had been under the other party's control for such a long time. This made these cultivators who thought highly of themselves and thought that they were far above Luo Fan. How could their expressions be good? Fellow Taoist, I admire your methods, a Seven Tribulation Expert said with a stiff expression at this moment. At this time, he did not even bother to show the slightest smile. For existences at their level, there was no way to hide each other's emotions at all. If they were angry in their hearts and forced a smile, they would only make their enemies happy and satisfied, and it would not have the effect of leaving them any face at all. In this case, he naturally had no interest in hanging that hypocritical smile. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "It's just some small tricks. Compared to you, it's really too lacking." Hearing this, the many Seven Tribulation Experts instantly knew that at this moment, Luo Fan was still unhappy with them for scheming against him. Even now that he had gained the absolute upper hand, and even exiled them from the path of Tao Master, he still did not completely feel relieved. Chapter 2566. At this point, these Seven Tribulation Experts had no other way to deal with Luo Fan than to personally go to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path and attack him. However, it was obvious that even if there were no other concerns, it was impossible for the Seven Tribulation Experts to enter the 5th level of the Tao Master's path with their real bodies. The Seven Tribulation Experts had already far surpassed the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. With such a huge gap, once they entered the 5th level, no matter how they tried to conceal themselves, they would inevitably attract the attention of the Tao Master's prison. When the power of the Tao Master's prison descended, even the Seven Tribulation Experts' real bodies would not be able to resist. Under such circumstances, they had no choice but to submit to Wang Chong. Even though they were already extremely unhappy with Luo Fan, even though their hearts were brewing with almost crazy anger, they had no choice but to obediently obey. As long as they did not want to be suppressed in the Tao Master's prison forever, this feeling of powerlessness made them feel resentful and began to regret that they had taken it for granted to plot against Luo Fan. This regret gnawed at their hearts like a poisonous snake, causing their expressions to become increasingly ugly. At this moment, Luo Fan simply said to the Seven Tribulation Experts, "Everyone, please go ahead. In 10 breaths, I will release your auras." Hearing this, these cultivators naturally understood his intention in an instant. This was clearly to give them 10 breaths to leave the Tao Master's path and head for a place of opportunity. After all, once Luo Fan released their auras, it would definitely attract the attention of the Tao Master's prison. At that time, the power of the Tao Master's prison would definitely search for the source of the auras. Not only would it cause trouble for these auras, it would also directly find their real bodies in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. If their state remained the same, then what awaited them would be eternal suppression. Therefore, their only choice was to take advantage of these 10 breaths to leave the Tao Master's path with their real bodies. This was obviously an ultimatum. At this moment, these Seven Tribulation Experts looked at each other, sighed, and gradually disappeared. Soon, all of them disappeared from the abyss. It was obvious that they had returned to where their main bodies were. It was extremely difficult to go in the opposite direction, but it was extremely easy to go in the same direction. These practitioners were experts of the seven tribulations, so the most suitable foothold for them was obviously the seventh layer of the road to Town Master. It was a matter of course for them to step into the seventh level. Naturally, they could do it by slightly relaxing the restrictions on their strength. As they left, the flow of time in the abyss returned to normal in the blink of an eye. Luo Fan silently counted 10 breaths of time and no longer hesitated. He directly slapped the cultivator behind him with the aura of the seven tribulation powerhouses contained in his body. With this slap, the aura began to erupt crazily. In the blink of an eye, it expanded tens of thousands of times and directly spread out of the abyss towards the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. All the cultivators on the fifth level of the Tao Master's path instantly felt a supreme aura pressing down on their bodies and minds. Boom, 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 boom. Terrifying roars erupted from somewhere and began to reverberate throughout the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Although the battle between Luo Fan and the seven tribulation experts had lasted tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years, in reality, to the cultivators outside the abyss, only a few breaths of time had passed. For them, this change was actually linked to the birth of the abyss. They had no idea that there was some kind of shocking battle in the process. They were just wondering why there was such a terrifying movement and why there was such an astonishing aura and scrupulously spreading everywhere. At this moment, the endless power of the Tao Master's prison was born out of nowhere and began to frantically gather towards the abyss. All the terrifying aura that had just spread out began to shrink at this moment. In the blink of an eye, it had already shrunk back into the abyss and completely merged with the abyss. Then, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to trace the source of the aura, as well as the starting point and source of the terrifying abyss. In the end, the power of the Tao Master's prison gradually turned blurry, as if it was ascending to an extremely high level. Not long after, with a soft poof, all the power of the Tao Master's prison disappeared without a trace. In other words, it had stepped into a higher level, which was above the fifth level of the Tao Master's prison. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan knew that his guess was correct. The power of the Tao Master's prison was indeed able to trace the source of the aura across levels. I hope you guys can leave fast enough. Luo Fan indifferently thought at this moment. If the seven tribulation experts had already left the Tao Master's path in 10 breaths of time and entered the land of opportunity, they would naturally have a great chance of escaping the suppression of the Tao Master's prison. However, if they treated Luo Fan's ultimatum as nonsense, then the only thing that awaited them now was obviously being suppressed. As for why they would obey Luo Fan's instructions and only have a great chance of escaping, the reason was actually very simple. After all, the land of opportunity was also constructed by the true saints of the Tao Master Great World. Although the true saints of the Tao Master Great World only participated in a portion of it, it did not guarantee that the Tao Master's path would not have the power to enforce it. Perhaps there was a small chance that the Tao Master's prison could still send power into the land of opportunity to suppress the cultivators who had committed a crime. However, the chances of this happening were very small and almost impossible at this moment. The cultivator who was being protected by Luo Fan came back to his senses and looked around in a daze. He didn't know what was going on and where he was at all. In fact, he had completely forgotten what he had just experienced. "Why am I here alone?" he murmured, completely ignoring Luo Fan's root incarnation. After all, Luo Fan's root incarnation could match the aura of a seven tribulation expert. It was impossible for this cultivator, who had barely become a five tribulation expert, to see through it. Similarly, in another location, the Tao Ancestor and Tianxing had also woken up and were also looking around blankly. They had no idea why they were here, and they had even forgotten what they had been trying to do. However, these cultivators were existences that could transcend the tall pagoda continent. and were not ignorant mortals. Very quickly, he had already guessed a few possibilities. They were probably involved in a battle that they did not have the qualifications to participate in. Only in this way could such a phenomenon occur that they could not comprehend at all. At that moment, the Tao ancestor bowed to the sky, then turned around and left with Tian Xing, heading toward the place where he had always lived. The cultivators in the abyss were not stupid, and they quickly came to a similar conclusion. They also bowed to the sky, and then quickly left the abyss. The abyss itself was rather dangerous, but perhaps it was because of his aura, or perhaps it was because he'd stayed in the abyss for a long time. His body and mind had unknowingly adapted to the abyss. So his movements in the abyss seemed to be extremely smooth, and he didn't even bump into anything. In just a few hours, he had already brazenly left the abyss and was heading toward the place where the cultivators who had transcended from the tall pagoda continent lived at an even faster speed. Luo Fan only smiled faintly at their actions. Most of his attention was on the abyss at this time. He was still quite curious about the fate of the abyss at this time. It should not be forgotten that the abyss was a place where the 7 tribulation experts would stay after returning from the land of opportunity. If their plan succeeded, the abyss would naturally become another forbidden area on the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. Being recognized by the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path, and even being blessed by the 5th level, would allow one to exist forever. But now, the plan of the 7 tribulation experts had failed. Of course, the abyss would not develop as their plan had succeeded. In this way, it was obviously quite worth pondering what would happen to the abyss. In the eyes of Luo Fan, at this moment, the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's Path was undergoing some kind of subtle tremor. All kinds of subtle forces began to radiate from all directions of the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path, constantly gathering toward the abyss at this moment, gradually oppressing the abyss. Under this kind of power, the abyss made a kind of cracking sound that could only be heard by the existence whose strength exceeded the 5 tribulation experts. That was to say, only Luo Fan, and those who had made deals with Luo Fan from the 6th, or even the 7th level could hear the cracking sound. Amidst this sound, the entire abyss was covered with cracks inside and outside. These cracks were extremely weak and small at first, and even Luo Fan would have overlooked them if he was not careful. But very quickly, these cracks began to increase and expand crazily. Gradually, they covered the entire abyss, making the entire abyss look like it was formed by the gathering of countless fragments. Is the entire abyss going to be completely destroyed? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but have such a thought in his mind. However, he soon realized that the situation wasn't as he had imagined. This was because after these fragments shattered to a certain extent, they did not continue to shatter, nor did they collapse. On the contrary, they began to push and overlap. In this kind of pushing and overlapping, the area occupied by the entire abyss began to shrink rapidly. At this time, in this abyss, no matter where one was under some kind of indescribable pressure. Even Luo Fan's root incarnation could feel the terrifying pressure constantly pressing down on him at this time. His root incarnation had no choice but to agitate its power to resist the pressure caused by this pushing and squeezing. Should I leave? At this moment, this thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind. This pressure was getting stronger and stronger. At first, it only made him feel pressured, but now, after a few breaths, the pressure was so strong that it made him feel like he was fighting with the aura clone of a 7 tribulation powerhouse. Although this was still not enough to cause him substantial damage, at this rate of growth, it was only a matter of time before it eventually caused substantial damage to him. Moreover, this problem of time was not too long. Perhaps after a few breaths, his root incarnation would collapse directly because it could not withstand the instantaneous blow. Such an outcome was obviously not what Luo Fan wanted. However, at the moment he had this thought, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration and discovered something that he had neglected. Perhaps this is an opportunity. This thought emerged in his mind. With this thought, he began to carefully observe the entire abyss, sensing the subtle changes that were occurring in the entire abyss now, and experiencing all kinds of secrets that had been hidden before. As he sensed it, his eyes gradually lit up. I didn't expect that there would be such a purpose. Fortunately, I came to stop it immediately, otherwise the consequences would be unimaginable. With this thought, he had completely dispelled the idea of leaving immediately, escaping from this abyss, and avoiding the changes produced by this abyss. Then, with a thought, his body collapsed, and the roots began to surge in all directions. In the blink of an eye, they turned into a root network and began to spread in all directions like a string of beads, stringing together pieces of abyss fragments, making them seem to turn into the space of this root network and gradually integrating with it. The pressure emitted from the outside world from the 5th level of the Town Master's path was still pouring in from all directions, constantly pressing on the abyss, causing it to shrink constantly. This shrinkage caused the countless fragments inside the abyss to push and overlap, continuing to continue. Finally, at a certain moment, when the root network formed by Luo Fan's root incarnation completely strung all the fragments in the entire abyss together, an inexplicable repulsive force suddenly appeared above the abyss. This repulsive force collided with the continuous squeezing force from the outside world, instantly producing an earth-shattering movement. A huge roar and shockwave were produced from the point of collision and began to spread in all directions, stirring up the endless light around, producing circles of ripples. The scene looked like the entire 5th level of the Town Master's path had turned into a surging ocean. 21,071. Chapter 2567. At this time, Luo Fan's expression became extremely solemn. Although the repulsive force that erupted from the abyss against the external pressure was produced by the abyss itself, it was still rooted in him. Therefore, although he did not need to bear the pressure completely, nor was he the main target of the terrifying pressure, but after all, he was already involved in it, so he still needed to bear a certain amount of pressure. At this time, he felt an amazing pressure passing through the abyss to his root incarnation, and then through his root incarnation to where his body was. It was this pressure that made him feel muffled sounds all over his body at this time, as if the old cowhide was bearing some kind of strong blow. However, that was all there was to it. After all, Luo Fan was much stronger than ordinary experts of the 6th tribulation. Even such pressure, for him, only made his body move a little, but it was not enough to cause real harm to him. This state lasted for quite a long time. After a full 100 years, the changes gradually subsided, and everything gradually returned to a stable state. At this time, the abyss had already turned into a deep, misty state. It appeared in the 5th level of the Town Master's Road, which was filled with boundless light. It seemed so special and so wonderful. In addition, compared to before, the size of this deep fog had shrunk by tens of thousands of times. The abyss in the past was like a huge scar on the 5th level of the Town Master's Road, so conspicuous that it made people wonder if the entire 5th level would collapse because of the existence of this huge scar. But now this fog seemed insignificant. Even compared to the forbidden area that Luo Fan refined, it was much smaller, and even compared to the stars condensed by the light in the 5th level, it was not much bigger. At this time, Luo Fan felt that he had mastered another existence similar to the forbidden area. In it, there was endless space, infinite power, and countless mysterious principles. Faintly, there was a kind of mystery hidden in it that neither the experts of the 5th tribulation nor the 6th tribulation could comprehend compared to the real forbidden area in the 5th level of the Town Master's Road. This existence was naturally much weaker, but it was enough to withstand the cultivation of countless experts of the 5th tribulation in the 5th level of the Town Master's Road. Sure enough, not only can it be used to withstand the pressure brought by the opportunity, but it can also be used as a substitute. At this time, an inexplicable light appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he actually somewhat admired those experts of the 7th tribulation. When those 7th tribulation powerhouses built the abyss, they didn't just build a solid place to stay. Instead, they integrated more ideas into it. They wanted to use the abyss to achieve more of their goals. One of them was what Luo fans said at this time. They regarded it as their substitute, which could replace the dangers they encountered in the place of opportunity. The reason why Luo fan could see this was that he had previously discovered that the original abyss was not empty space, but contained endless mysteries, including the infinite principles of the way of cultivation. If he had known this before he fought with those experts of the seventh tribulation, it would have been difficult for him to determine what they were thinking. After all, the way of cultivation was all-encompassing, and it could almost be said to be an encyclopedia of cultivation. However, after he fought with those experts of the seventh tribulation, he already knew that although these way of cultivation seemed endless, in the final analysis, it was born from 13 sources. And those 13 sources were none other than the way of cultivation of the 13 experts of the seventh tribulation. After understanding this, how could he not understand their intentions? For cultivators, their own way of cultivation was the most fundamental attribute other than the origin of life. For any two cultivators, no matter how similar their way of cultivation was, as long as they walked their own way of cultivation, their way of cultivation would definitely be unique. Even if they looked exactly the same, or even if they were described in any precise language, there would definitely be some differences between them if one were to analyze them accurately. That difference was like the essence of life, the origin of life. It was an inherent attribute of life, a characteristic that no existence could change. When one's way of cultivation reached a certain level, a cultivator would be able to use this unique attribute and characteristic. For example, if a cultivator cultivated their way of cultivation, they would be able to clearly sense many things. For example, if a cultivator cultivated their way of cultivation, they would be able to clearly sense their every move, even their every thought. This was only the ordinary way of cultivation. If there was something special, such as a backdoor or a way of cultivation that had a suppressive characteristic, then the cultivator could even control the existence of the way of cultivation at will, control the body, control the mind, control the spirit, control the essence of life, and even possess. If a fifth or sixth tribulation expert could do this, then a seventh tribulation expert could naturally do even more. For example, leaving a certain way of cultivation in a certain place would allow one to transfer all sorts of injuries to another place at any time, but this was only the most common use. In Luo fans' understanding, this method could even be used as a method of rebirth. In other words, even if a cultivator's body and soul were destroyed somewhere else, as long as the cultivator's Tao of cultivation existed somewhere else, then the cultivator would be able to use the Tao of cultivation to condense his own life essence and life essence once more, allowing him to be completely resurrected. Of course, it was extremely difficult to completely resurrect with the help of the way of cultivation. Not only did it have a high requirement for the way of cultivation, but it also had a high requirement for the cultivator themselves. The compatibility between the two and the cultivator's degree of understanding of the way of cultivation had to reach an unimaginable level in order to have a chance of success. In this aspect, even an ordinary fifth tribulation cultivator was still a little lacking. Only a sixth tribulation expert or above could guarantee to completely meet this requirement. As for seventh tribulation experts, there is no need to say anything more. Of course, this did not mean that the requirement for a cultivator was the way of cultivation. Rather, if one did not meet these two requirements, it would be very difficult for a cultivator to cultivate to that level. It was because of this understanding that Luo Fan knew that this abyss contained an extremely complete way of cultivation for the 13 seven tribulation experts, and he knew what they were thinking. However, it was obvious that this idea of theirs was now useless. It was not only because Luo Fan had taken over the entire abyss as his own and regarded their path of cultivation as resources for his own growth. It was also because the Tao Master's path had already remembered their auras. Once they reappeared in the Tao Master's path, the power of the Tao Master's prison would definitely descend immediately, directly wrap around them, and suppress them in the deepest part of the Tao Master's prison. It was naturally impossible for them to wait for the news to die down before returning. One should know that the Tao Master's path was not like any other. For it, billions of trillions of years was just a blink of an eye. No matter how many years it took for those 7 tribulation experts to return, the power of the Tao Master's prison would definitely descend. In this way, unless they had the strength to fight against the Tao Master's path, otherwise, no matter how bold they would not activate the means of resurrection. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly, and the fog formed by the abyss began to tremble slightly. The entire fog seemed to have suddenly gained some kind of strange power and began to stretch and shrink, tremble and tremble. The endless abyss fragments contained within were constantly surging at this moment, and the many fragments that were originally overlapping with each other suddenly opened and closed. It was this abrupt opening and closing of the abyss fragments that caused the entire fog to seem to stretch and shrink. An inexplicable power suddenly emerged from the contraction of the fog and began to circulate among the countless abyss fragments along the network constructed by the roots of Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. It formed a tide-like cycle, wave after wave, again and again. Every time the power circulated, it would drive the endless space-time, endless truth, and endless way of cultivation contained in the fog to circulate among the numerous abyss fragments and gradually be absorbed by them, gradually dispersed, and integrated into the abyss fragments. This cycle clearly contained incomparably subtle and incomparably mysterious truth. The cultivation of those 7th tribulation experts seemed extremely powerless in this cycle. They didn't even have the chance to struggle before they were gradually disintegrated. As these way of cultivation were decomposed, the abyssal fragments that had been integrated with the various existences that had been decomposed also gradually changed. The original abyssal nature gradually faded, and all kinds of other strange natures began to gradually emerge. During this process, the faint connection between the cultivators that had a close connection with these way of cultivation began to gradually weaken. At least, in Luo Fan's perception, that connection was becoming less and less. At an extremely high level, the way of cultivation had already turned into an inherent attribute of the cultivator, becoming a unique characteristic. However, it was ultimately a whole that was formed by the combination of many details. For such a whole, if many details changed, the whole would naturally deviate more and more. For ordinary cultivators, this kind of deviation might not cause much of a change, but the principles and profundities contained within it were still not reduced by much. However, for the owner of the way of cultivation, this was a fatal change. As the way of cultivation deviated more and more from the original, the connection between it and its owner would become weaker and weaker. In the end, when the deviation exceeded a certain limit, the way of cultivation would become a way of cultivation that had no connection with its owner at all. At that time, it would be impossible to sense the surroundings with the help of the way of cultivation, or to use the way of cultivation to bear the damage in place of oneself, or even to use the way of cultivation to be reborn. And this was what Luo Fan was currently doing. He had already decided to exile those cultivators and completely cut off their hope of returning to the path of Tao Sovereign. At this time, if he kept the way of cultivation here and allowed it to play its original role, wouldn't it still open the door for them to return? At that time, those 7 tribulation powerhouses would have a chance to influence the state of the fog with the help of the way of cultivation. Perhaps when they were enlightened, they would comprehend how to use the way of cultivation to bring the fog back into their control and use it as a foothold to return to the path of Tao Sovereign. At that time, wouldn't Luo Fan only be able to watch them float away? If that was the case, what was the point of him working so hard to expel them? Was it just to form a grudge? Therefore, it was impossible for him to completely retain the way of cultivation. Even if they were the most valuable existences in the fog, it was still the same. The initial decomposition and stripping was naturally not difficult. Even a 7 tribulation powerhouse's way of cultivation could not be completely integrated and inseparable. Apart from a certain key part of the core, the other parts of the way of cultivation were actually scattered and connected to the core. Of course, it wouldn't be too difficult to separate such an existence from its body. At least, it was not too difficult for Luo Fan. However, when these scattered parts were almost separated, the next task was obviously more and more difficult. The core's integration and exclusion made it so that even if it was scoured by that strange power, it would not change. It circulated in the countless abyss fragments again and again, and in the end, it polished the core to become more and more perfect and resplendent. This change made Luo Fan secretly admire in his heart, as expected of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. This way of cultivation is really extraordinary. This process lasted for 3 years. In the end, the appearance of the countless abyssal fragments in the mist had changed, and the outside of the mist still looked like mist. But what they saw after entering was already an incomparably fantastical group of worlds.